Hello everyone, welcome back to History Channel. The scroll that survived the flame. There is a hand clutching parchment, running through streets filled with smoke. The air is thick with ash and the smell of burning papyrus, that particular acrid scent when knowledge itself turns to fire, when the accumulated wisdom of centuries becomes fuel for flames that care nothing for what they consume. Behind the runner, the great library district is collapsing into chaos, whether through deliberate destruction or the accident of war, whether this is the famous burning or one of the many smaller catastrophes that gradually claimed what Alexandria had gathered. The result is the same. Smoke rising from the harbor, darkness at noon, the end of something that had seemed permanent. But this chapter is not about what was lost. It is about what survived. It is about the scroll that escaped, about the single text that made it out when thousands did not, about the act of preservation as sacred resistance, as defiance against those who would erase, as duty to the future performed by those who understood that not everything could be saved, but something must be. The emotional arc follows this understanding that in the moment of catastrophe, choices must be made, that preservation becomes curation, becomes triage, that someone fleeing a burning library cannot carry everything but can carry something, and the something they choose to carry becomes, through that choice, the knowledge that survives, that passes forward, that reaches us across the centuries because one person, in one desperate moment, decided this text was worth saving, worth risking everything for, worth carrying through smoke and danger to whatever safety might lie beyond. It is said that the scholar, we do not know their name, do not know if they were librarian or visiting researcher, young or old, Egyptian or Greek or from one of the dozen other cultures that sent their brightest to study in Alexandria, grabbed what they could reach, what was nearest, what their hands found in the confusion and smoke. But perhaps the choice was more deliberate. Perhaps they moved through the library with purpose, ignoring lesser works, seeking the irreplaceable, the unique copy, the text that existed nowhere else, that would be lost forever if it burned here. What criteria guide such choices? How does one decide, in moments that allow no reflection, which knowledge deserves to survive? Some texts were chosen for their rarity, the only copy, the sole surviving manuscript of an author whose other works were already lost. Some for their sacredness, scriptures, ritual texts, words believed to carry divine authority that must not be allowed to perish. Some for their utility, medical knowledge, agricultural techniques, engineering principles that communities would need to rebuild, to continue, to maintain the practical arts that civilization required. And some, perhaps, were chosen for love, for the beauty of their language, for the questions they posed, for the way they made the reader think, or feel, or see the world differently, for reasons that had nothing to do with practical calculation and everything to do with the conviction that these particular words, this particular arrangement of thought and expression, was precious beyond measure, was worth protecting even at the cost of the protector's safety, was sacred, not because gods had spoken it, but because human consciousness had created it, and human consciousness deserved to have access to what its ancestors had achieved. The atmosphere throughout must be urgent, but hushed, the desperate quiet of those who move through danger carrying irreplaceable things, who understand that survival depends on not being noticed, on slipping through chaos without attracting attention, on reaching safety before the smoke or the soldiers or the collapsing buildings claim both the carrier and the cargo. We follow now the roots of preservation, the networks that caught these fleeing texts and carried them forward, the chains of transmission that stretched across the Mediterranean world and beyond, connecting Alexandria to monasteries in the Egyptian desert, to libraries in Constantinople, to scriptoria in Ireland, where monks who had never seen Alexandria copied texts that had been copied from texts that had escaped the burning, each copy creating redundancy, increasing the chances that something would survive the next catastrophe, the next war, the next fire, the next zealous reformer who saw old books as threats rather than treasures. Some texts were hidden in caves, sealed in jars, buried in the desert to wait for safer times that might never come, that did not come for centuries, for millennia, until archaeologists or shepherds or treasure hunters stumbled upon collections that had been deliberately concealed, that had been entrusted to the earth because human institutions had failed. Because the keeper of the text understood that they could not guarantee its protection, but perhaps the stone and sand could, perhaps the dry desert air would preserve what human care could not. Other texts were smuggled out more deliberately, hidden in merchant cargo, carried along trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, copied and translated as they traveled, Egyptian to Greek to Syriac to Arabic to Latin, each translation an act of preservation, each new language a hedge against the possibility that any single linguistic tradition might fail, might lose the text because no one still spoke the language it was written in, because the culture that had valued it had vanished or transformed beyond recognition. Beneath the silence of these transmission networks, we sense the magnitude of what was at stake, the recognition by those who participated that they were not merely preserving books, but maintaining connection between past and future, ensuring that what previous generations had learned would be available to those who came after, that the thread of knowledge would not break entirely even when it was reduced to the thinnest strand, to the single copy, to the lone scholar who remembered. Some believe that what survived was not random, that the text we have represent not accident but selection, that the preservation networks prioritized certain kinds of knowledge, that what reached us is not representative sample but curated collection, shaped by the values and interests of the preservers, by what they thought future generations would need or value, by their own sense of what deserved to survive when not everything could be saved. And there is truth in this. The Christian monks who copied classical texts throughout the Middle Ages preserved what served their purposes: philosophy that seemed compatible with theology, scientific texts that did not challenge sacred scripture, literature that could be read allegorically. Other texts were neglected, were allowed to decay, were not copied when the parchment wore out, were gradually lost not through dramatic destruction, but through the quiet failure to preserve, through the decision that this text was not worth the expensive labor of copying, that the parchment could be better used for something else, that what this author had to say did not need to reach the future. Yet despite this curation, despite the filtering, despite the losses both dramatic and gradual, what survived is still miraculous, still testament to the dedication of those who understood preservation as duty, who copied texts they could not read, who maintained libraries through centuries when books were threatened from every direction, who passed forward what they had received with the faith that future generations would find value in it, would be grateful for the connection to the deep past that these texts provided. We close now imagining the moment when the saved scroll is finally opened again, when the danger has passed or transformed into different dangers, when what was hidden can emerge again into light. Perhaps decades have passed, perhaps centuries. The person who saved the text is long dead. The civilization that burned his memory, if that. The world has changed in ways the original saver could not have imagined, but the text remains. The words are still, they're faded, perhaps damaged by time and handling, but readable, still capable of communicating across the vast temporal gap, still carrying the thoughts of someone who lived when Alexandria still stood, when the library still functioned, when knowledge was gathered and protected, until the day, it wasn't until the day, the smoke rose and choices had to be made, and someone chose this text, this arrangement of words, this particular knowledge as worth saving. The hands that open the scroll now are gentle, reverent, aware that they hold something fragile and irreplaceable, something that survived against odds that should have claimed it, that made it through fire and exile and the indifference of centuries, to arrive in this moment, to be read again, to complete the journey from the hand that carried it out of burning Alexandria to the hand that opens it now, ready to receive what it has waited so long to give. Perhaps the text is philosophical questions about the nature of existence, about virtue and knowledge, about how to live well in a world that is often hostile to such aspirations. Perhaps it is scientific astronomical observations, mathematical proofs, medical knowledge that took generations to accumulate and that would have taken generations more to rediscover if it had been entirely lost. Perhaps it is literary poetry or drama or narrative, the attempt of human consciousness to create beauty through language, to make something that would outlast its maker, that would carry forward not information, but experience, not facts, but feeling, not knowledge, but the distilled essence of what it meant To be alive in a particular time and place and body and mind. Whatever it is, it survived. Against the flames, against the chaos, against the forgetting and the deliberate erasure, and the simple entropy that claims all things, it survived. Because someone carried it, because someone copied it, because someone hid it, or translated it, or simply did not throw it away when they could have, when it would have been easier to let it go, to make room for something else, to allow the past to remain past, rather than insisting that it travel forward, that it remain present, that it continue speaking to whoever is willing to listen. The thread of transmission is so fragile. A single copy in the wrong place at the wrong time, a single fire or flood or moment of carelessness, and the text is gone forever, joins the vast majority of ancient knowledge that did not survive, that exists now only as references in other texts, as titles listed in catalogs of libraries, that no longer exist as gaps in the historical record that we can sense but never fill. Yet the thread held. This one time, in this one case, despite everything that might have severed it, the connection remained intact. The knowledge passed forward. The scroll survived the flame, and somewhere in that survival is testimony not just to the durability of parchment or the skill of scribes, but to the human conviction that what we learn matters, that knowledge is worth preserving, that the future deserves access to what the past discovered, that consciousness creates things of value that should not be allowed to perish simply because the bodies that created them are temporary, because the civilizations that produced them are fragile, because fire consumes and time erodes, and entropy eventually claims everything. But not today, not this text, not this scroll that survived the flame, that rests now in careful hands, that opens to reveal words written long ago by someone who hoped they would last, who hoped they would be read, who hoped that what they had learned or created or understood would reach forward across time to touch minds they would never meet, in circumstances they could not imagine, world transformed beyond their recognition, but still, somehow, still connected to their moment by these words. This scroll, this fragile material carrier of immaterial thought that survives as long as someone preserves it, as long as someone reads it, as long as the thread of transmission continues, passing from hand to hand, from age to age, from the smoke-filled streets of burning Alexandria to the quiet room where the scroll opens now, revealing what it has carried, sharing what it has preserved, speaking across the centuries in a voice that should have been silenced, but was not, that survived because someone decided it should, because someone carried it through the fire and out the other side, because someone chose preservation over loss, memory over forgetting, the future's right to know over the present's power to erase. The scroll rests open, the words wait to be read, and the flame that tried to claim them burns only in memory now, defeated by the hand that saved, by the will that preserved, by the chain of care that carried this knowledge forward across time and catastrophe to arrive here now, still speaking, still teaching, still bearing witness to what humans once knew, and what we, through dedicated preservation, still know, because the scroll survived the flame. The language they spoke before Babel, there is a tower rising from the plain of Shinar, brick upon brick, reaching toward heaven with ambition that speaks louder than any words. And at its base, something breaks. Not the stone, not the mortar mixed with bitumen, but something more fundamental. The single tongue that had unified the builders suddenly fractures, splinters, multiplies into incomprehensible diversity. The workers who moments ago understood each other perfectly now stare in confusion, their voices producing sounds that carry no meaning to those who hear them, their gestures growing more desperate as they realize that what was unified has shattered, that they cannot complete the tower because they can no longer coordinate, can no longer share the vision that brought them here, can no longer speak the language that made them one people with one purpose, ascending toward the divine. But this chapter is not about what the myth tells us happened. It is about what the myth might mean about the deeper truth that stories sometimes carry better than history, about the recognition encoded in this ancient tale that communication itself is the tower we can never quite complete, that perfect understanding between minds is the heaven we can never quite reach, that even when we speak the same language meaning remains partial, translation imperfect, the space between what I intend and what you understand forever unbridgeable. The emotional journey moves from the literal to the symbolic, from the historical question of whether a single ancestral language existed to the philosophical meditation on whether perfect communication is even possible, whether the multiplicity of languages is symptom or cause of the fundamental isolation that characterizes consciousness, whether Babel is a story about divine punishment or about the intrinsic nature of meaning itself. It is said that linguists have worked backward through time, tracing the genealogies of languages, following modern diversity back toward ancient unity, reconstructing the ghost tongues that were never written but must have existed, must have been spoken by people whose names we will never know, whose lives left no record except the words they used, words that evolved and changed and branched into the thousands of languages that exist today, but that carry within them still the traces of their origin, the fossils of ancient pronunciations, the DNA of linguistic ancestry. This reconstruction is called Proto-Indo-European, the hypothetical common ancestor of languages from Sanskrit to Celtic, from Greek to Germanic, from Romance to Slavic, a language that united vast territories across Eurasia before it fragmented, before its speakers dispersed and their dialects diverged until they became mutually incomprehensible, until the children of those who once understood each other could no longer communicate, until the linguistic unity was so completely shattered that scholars in the 19th century had to slowly painstakingly demonstrate that these apparently unrelated languages were actually cousins descended from a common source that had left its fingerprints and shared vocabulary, in parallel grammatical structures, in sound changes that followed predictable patterns, suggesting not coincidence, but inheritance. The atmosphere is one of linguistic archaeology, of excavating meaning from the layers of language, of recognizing that every word we speak carries history. That etymology is not mere trivia, but a form of memory, that when we say father or mother, we are speaking sounds that have been passed down across millennia, pronounced by Bronze Age herders and Iron Age warriors and medieval peasants and modern citizens. The words changing gradually, but recognizably, carrying forward the vocalizations of ancestors stretching back to the speakers of Proto-Indo-European, who used similar sounds to designate the same relationships, whose ph-ter and mhtr became our father and mother through thousands of years of linguistic evolution, through sound shifts and borrowings and the slow drift that affects all living languages, that makes them simultaneously stable and fluid, simultaneously continuous with their past and constantly changing. Linguists can reconstruct words for snow and wolf, for wheel and horse, for father and brother and daughter. They can determine with reasonable confidence that Proto-Indo-European speakers knew about horses and wheels, suggesting they lived after the domestication of these animals and the invention of wheeled vehicles, dating the language to sometime around 4000 to 500 BC. They can identify words for family relationships, for body parts, for basic actions and objects, creating a vocabulary that gives glimpses into the lives and concerns of people who lived 6,000 years ago, who left no written records, whose material culture is mostly vanished, but whose language survives encoded in the languages their descendants speak, whose words are still our words, transformed, but traceable, ancient, but still alive. Yet, for all this reconstruction, Proto-Indo-European remains a ghost language, a scholarly consensus about what probably existed but was never written down, never recorded in its pure form, never spoken by anyone living today. It exists only as hypothesis, as the common ancestor that must have existed for the daughter languages to be as similar as they are, as the source from which the diversity flowed, as the linguistic unity that predated Babel, that demonstrates that at least within one branch of the human family tree, something like a common tongue once existed before it shattered into the multiplicity we now navigate. Some believe that before Proto-Indo-European, there might have been even earlier unities, deeper ancestral languages from which Proto-Indo-European itself descended, that if we could trace back far enough, we would eventually reach a point where humanity spoke a single language, where the dream of Babel was reality, where there was one speech and one set of words for all the earth. But the deeper we go, the more speculative the reconstruction becomes, the more tenuous the connections, Until finally we reach depths where linguistic archaeology cannot follow, where the evidence has eroded beyond recovery, where we can only guess whether such unity ever existed or whether languages have always been multiple, always diverging, and converging and changing in patterns too complex to reduce to a single origin story. Beneath the silence of these lost languages, we sense the magnitude of what vanished when they died, when their last speakers passed away without teaching their children, when conquest or migration or gradual replacement left no one who remembered the old words, the old ways of naming reality, the old conceptual frameworks that shaped how their speakers understood and categorized existence. Because languages are not just different labels for the same universal concepts. Languages carve up reality differently, create different categories, embody different ways of thinking about time and space, about agency and causation, about what deserves to be marked grammatically and what can remain implicit. When a language dies, we lose not just vocabulary, but an entire way of understanding, a lens through which human consciousness once viewed the world. A framework for making sense of experience that cannot be fully translated into other languages, because the categories themselves are unique, because the logic is its own, because what was easy to express in that language becomes clumsy or impossible in others. What did speakers of Proto-Indo-European think about, worry about, value, fear? We can reconstruct some words, but not the stories they told, not the jokes they laughed at, not the poetry that moved them, not the philosophical or theological or ethical frameworks within which their vocabulary made sense. We have the words for snow and wolf, but not the myths about them, not the associations they carried, not the ways these concepts wove through their culture, creating meaning that transcended literal definition. The chapter deepens now into the question of whether linguistic multiplicity is curse or blessing, whether Babel represents divine punishment or divine gift, whether the confusion of tongues is tragedy or triumph, whether we should mourn the loss of universal understanding or celebrate the creativity that emerges from diversity, from the necessity of translation, from the productive failure of perfect communication. On one hand, the inability to understand each other creates conflict, enables dehumanization, makes possible the wars and atrocities that depend on seeing the other as fundamentally alien, as incomprehensible, as somehow less than fully human, because they speak differently, think differently, categorize reality differently. The dream of universal language is the dream of universal understanding, of a world where no one is foreign, where communication is transparent, where meaning passes between minds without the friction of translation, where we could finally say what we mean and be understood exactly as we intend. On the other hand, linguistic diversity is creative, generative, the source of new ways of thinking that would not emerge if everyone spoke the same language with the same conceptual categories. Translation is not mere transfer, but transformation, not simple substitution, but complex negotiation, the process by which we discover that what seemed obvious in one language is strange in another, that assumptions we didn't know we were making are revealed in the act of trying to communicate across linguistic boundaries, that the spaces where meaning fails to transfer cleanly are often the spaces where new understanding emerges, where we are forced to think beyond our native categories, to see that our way of organizing reality is not the only way, the natural way, just one way among many. Perhaps the myth of Babel is not about punishment, but about recognition, not about loss, but about truth, the acknowledgement that perfect understanding between minds is impossible because minds are separate, because consciousness is irreducibly individual, because even when we speak the same language, we are always translating, always approximating, always trying to convey inner experience through external symbols that can never quite capture what we mean, that always leave gaps, that always require interpretation, that always introduce the possibility of misunderstanding. And perhaps those gaps are not defects but features, not bugs but essential elements of what makes human communication rich rather than simply efficient, poetic rather than merely informational, creative rather than purely replicative. Perhaps the spaces between languages where translation fails and meaning slips away are sites of generativity, where new concepts emerge from the collision of different ways of thinking, where hybrid understanding develops that belongs fully to neither source nor target language, but creates something new in the space between. We close now contemplating the tower itself, the structure that was never completed, because the linguistic unity it required shattered at its base, because the dream of reaching heaven through coordinated human effort foundered on the impossibility of perfect communication, because the builders discovered what we continue to discover, that we are always building towers we cannot complete, always reaching toward understanding we cannot fully achieve, always speaking across distances we cannot entirely bridge. Yet we continue building, we continue speaking, we continue trying to communicate despite knowing that perfect understanding will always elude us, that the other's mind remains ultimately mysterious, that even in our native language we struggle to convey what we mean, to articulate what we feel, to share what we understand in ways that preserve the understanding, rather than transforming it into something else, something similar, but not identical, something recognizable, but not quite right. Perhaps that is the wisdom encoded in Babel, the recognition that we are linguistic creatures living in permanent diaspora from perfect communication, forever scattered from the unity that may never have existed, forever speaking languages that divide as much as they connect, that make possible both profound understanding and profound misunderstanding, that enable us to share consciousness across the void between minds, while simultaneously reminding us that the sharing is always incomplete, always approximate, always requiring faith that what I say means something similar to you as it does to me, though we can never be entirely certain, though the words themselves guarantee nothing. The tower stands unfinished, as it must, as perhaps it should. The languages multiply as they have, as they will. And somewhere in the babel, in the beautiful confusion of voices speaking different tongues, with different logics, organizing different realities, humanity continues its impossible project, building meaning from sound, creating understanding from grammar, reaching toward each other across the spaces between languages, between minds, between the isolation of individual consciousness and the dream of connection that drives us to speak despite knowing that every utterance is a tower we cannot complete, every conversation a Babel we willingly enter, every word a bridge across a distance that remains, that must remain, because that distance is what makes us separate, what makes us seek connection, what makes communication not simple transmission, but sacred attempt, endlessly renewed, eternally incomplete. The human project of reaching toward understanding that we approach, but never quite achieve, that we build toward knowing the tower can never be finished, that we speak toward knowing we can never be perfectly understood, yet speaking anyway, building anyway, reaching still toward the heaven of mutual comprehension that remains forever just beyond the highest brick, the final word, the perfect translation that would make us finally, fully transparent to each other, that would complete the tower and end the work, and perhaps end also the beautiful, tragic, creative necessity of continuing to speak, to translate, to reach across the spaces between languages toward the understanding that awaits in the incompletion, in the gap, in the silence, where meaning transforms and Babel reveals itself, not as punishment, but as invitation to continue building, continue speaking, continue reaching toward the unity we can imagine, but never fully inhabit, the single language we once spoke, if we ever did, before the tower, before the scattering, before words themselves divided us into the multiplicity we now are, speaking our separate tongues, building our separate towers, all reaching toward the same unreachable heaven, all speaking the same unspeakable hope that somehow, despite everything, we might be understood. The maps they drew of paradise. There is a hand moving across vellum, drawing rivers that flow from Eden. The cartographer works by candlelight, carefully placing each line, each symbol, building a world that is both memory and geography, both spiritual longing and physical space. The rivers are four: Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, Euphrates, and they flow outward from a garden drawn at the eastern edge of the known world, at the limit where human travel ends and divine mystery begins, where the map transforms from catalogue of lands that merchants visit to illustration of realms that exist beyond the merely physical, that occupy space and consciousness as much as on earth. This is paradise located. This is Eden, given coordinates. This is the origin of humanity, mapped as if it were a city you could visit. If only you could cross the mountains that guard it. If only you could navigate the rivers that flow from it. If only you could find the passage through the wall of flame that separates the fallen world from the garden where God still walks in the cool of the evening, where the tree of life still grows, where everything remains as it was before the exile, waiting for a return that theology promises, but geography makes impossible. The emotional arc follows the desire to map what cannot be visited, to give spatial form to spiritual truth, to insist through cartography that paradise is not merely metaphor but actual location, not just mythic past, but continuing present, unreachable, but real, somewhere beyond the edge of the world, yet still part of the world. Separated from us, not by non-existence, but by barriers we cannot cross, by distances we cannot traverse, by the consequences of a choice made so long ago that it precedes all maps, all memory, all recorded time. It is said that medieval cartographers understood geography differently than we do, that for them every location had spiritual significance, that the earth itself was a text written by divine hand, that to map the world was to trace the outlines of sacred history, to position yourself within the story that stretched from Eden in the east to Jerusalem at the center, to wherever you stood at the edges, reading yourself into the geography that placed you spatially in relation to the origin and the redemption, that told you where you were not just in miles but in meaning. The opening image is intimate, the cartographer's hand, the pen made from goose quill, the ink mixed from oak galls and iron, the vellum prepared from calfskin, stretched and scraped until it becomes the surface on which the world can be drawn. This is craft as much as knowledge, art as much as science, devotion as much as documentation. The map being created is not merely practical guide but theological statement, not just representation of space but interpretation of existence itself. We explore now specific medieval maps that have survived the centuries, that show us how paradise was cartographed, how the spiritual was given spatial form, how belief became geography. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around 1,300, places Jerusalem at the center of a circular world, Eden at the top, which is east. Because medieval maps were oriented with east at the apex, toward sunrise, toward origins, toward the direction from which light and meaning came. The garden is drawn in detail, trees and rivers, Adam and Eve before the fall, the serpent coiled around the tree of knowledge, all rendered in ink that has faded but not disappeared, that still conveys after 700 years the cartographer's conviction that this was actual geography, that somewhere in the east, beyond the lands that could be reached, the garden still existed, still contained the tree of life, still held the possibility of return if only the way could be found, if only the barriers could be crossed. The Ebstorf map, even larger, even more elaborate, places Christ's head at the east, his feet at the west, his hands reaching north and south, making the entire world into the body of Christ, making geography itself incarnational, making every journey a movement through sacred space, every location a point within the divine embrace that holds all creation. And there, at the eastern extremity, at the head of Christ, Eden is drawn, a paradise located where it must be, at the beginning, at the source, at the origin point from which everything flows. The atmosphere throughout is one of yearning made visible, the ache to return to origins rendered in ink and vellum, the desire to find the way back to the garden expressed through the careful placement of rivers and mountains, through the drawing of boundaries that separate the accessible from the unreachable, through the act of mapping what cannot be visited, but must be believed in, must be given location, must be positioned within the geography of the world, because its reality demands recognition, even if its accessibility remains forever denied. Some believe that medieval cartographers understood perfectly well that Eden could not be reached, that the garden was separated from the fallen world not by geography, but by theology, not by distance, but by the consequences of sin. That the rivers and mountains drawn as barriers were symbols rather than physical obstacles. That the placement of paradise at the eastern edge was spiritual truth, expressed through spatial metaphor. But perhaps this interpretation is too quick to separate what medieval consciousness held together, too eager to make distinctions between literal and symbolic that would have seemed artificial to those who believed that the spiritual and physical were not different realms, but interpenetrating aspects of the same reality. That paradise was simultaneously mythic and geographic, both beyond reach and actually located. That the map showed truth, even if the truth it showed exceeded what could be verified by travel, by exploration, by the empirical methods that would later transform cartography from theology into science. Beneath the silence of these ancient maps, we sense the magnitude of what they attempted, the ambition to contain all existence within a single image, to show the world not just as it appeared to travelers, but as it was understood by faith, to make the map into a cosmology, a theology, a complete worldview that positioned humanity between Eden in the east and judgment in the west, between origin and destiny, between the garden we left and the kingdom we sought, the map itself becoming pilgrimage route, showing the journey from where we began to where we were meant to go, showing the spiritual geography that physical travel merely illustrated. Pilgrimage in medieval understanding was not metaphor for spiritual journey. Pilgrimage was spiritual journey, the physical movement through sacred landscape toward sacred destination, enacting in body what occurred in soul. The miles walked corresponding to progress made, the hardships endured purifying the traveler, preparing them for the encounter with holiness that awaited at journey's end. To walk to Jerusalem or Santiago or Rome was to move not just across space, but through meaning, to inhabit geography as sacred text, to read the landscape as scripture written in mountains and rivers and shrines and relics in the accumulated holiness of places where the divine had touched the earthly, where the boundary between heaven and earth had grown thin enough for something to pass through. And if sacred sites could be mapped, if Jerusalem and Rome could be given coordinates, if the places where Christ walked could be located with precision, then why not Eden? Why not give paradise its place on the map? Acknowledge that the garden was real location. Mark its position even if the way to reach it was blocked, even if the return was impossible, even if the map could only show where paradise was, not how to get there, could only gesture toward origins without providing the route back, could only mark the destination without making it accessible. The chapter deepens now into questions that have no simple answers, that hover between the literal and the symbolic, that ask what it means to believe in something enough to map it, to give it coordinates, to position it within the geography of the known world, even when the known world cannot reach it, when the distance is measured not in miles but in exile, no, in terrain, but in transformation, not in what separates here from there, but in what separates then from now, unfallen from fallen, paradise from the world that remembers paradise only as loss, as longing, as the ache to return to what can never be regained. Because the garden itself has not moved, but we have changed, have been changed, have become something that cannot simply walk back through the gates, even if we could find them. Was Eden on these maps meant literally? Did the cartographers believe that if you traveled far enough east, you would eventually reach mountains or flames or rivers that marked the boundary of paradise, that you could stand at the edge of the garden and peer in, seeing what had been lost, experiencing the proximity without the access, the nearness without the ability to enter? Or was the mapping always symbolic, always a way of insisting that paradise was real, without claiming it occupied space in the way that France or England occupied space? Without suggesting that physical travel could bring you there, acknowledging instead that the distance was of a different kind, that the separation was metaphysical rather than geographical, that Eden remained exactly where it had always been, but we were the ones who had been exiled from paradise, not by crossing distance, but by crossing the boundary between innocence and knowledge, between obedience and choice, between the garden where everything was given, and the world where everything must be worked for. Perhaps both. Perhaps the medieval mind did not require choosing between literal and symbolic, because both were true, Because the map showed physical geography that corresponded to spiritual reality. Because Eden was actually somewhere, even if the somewhere transcended ordinary spatial categories. Because the cartographer could draw the garden in the east, and mean both that it was literally there, and that its presence there meant something beyond geography. Carried theological significance that made its location matter, even if the location could never be visited. We close now before a map spread across a table illuminated by uncertain light, showing the world as medieval consciousness understood it. Jerusalem at the center, Eden at the eastern edge, the known lands arranged between them, the entire earth organized around sacred sites, around moments when the divine had intersected the human, around places that mattered not for their resources or strategic position, but for their role in the story of salvation, in the narrative that gave meaning to existence, that positioned every place and every person within the drama that stretched from creation to apocalypse, from the garden where it began to the kingdom where it would end. The map shows both the world as it is, and the world as it should be, both the geography that travelers know and the geography that faith demands, both the lands that can be reached and the lands that exist beyond reach, both the cities where merchants trade and the garden where God walks, both the fallen world we inhabit and the paradise we remember, we long for. We map at the eastern edge of everything, oriented toward sunrise, toward origins, toward the beginning that we cannot return to, but cannot stop imagining, cannot stop locating, cannot stop drawing on our maps, even though we know the way is blocked, even though we know the return is impossible, even though we know that the distance between here and Eden is measured not in miles, but in something else entirely, something that maps can gesture toward but never quite capture, something that cartography can acknowledge but never quite overcome. Perhaps that is why they drew it anyway. Perhaps that is why Eden appears on medieval maps, despite the impossibility of reaching it, why paradise is given coordinates despite being beyond geography, why the garden is located despite being inaccessible. Because the alternative, a map without paradise, a world with no marked origin, a geography that does not acknowledge where we came from, even if it cannot show us how to return, was unthinkable, was to make the world less than it was to pretend that the spiritual dimension did not exist simply because it could not be measured in the ways that ordinary space was measured. The hand that drew these maps knew what it was doing. It was mapping longing. It was giving spatial form to ache. It was acknowledging through ink and vellum that somewhere, somehow, paradise was real, that the garden existed, that Eden was not merely story but location, unreachable but actual, beyond access, but within the world, separated from us by barriers that were both physical and metaphysical, both geographical and theological, both mapped and unmappable. And perhaps every map since has been an echo of this original project, every act of cartography an attempt to impose meaning on space, to organize chaos into pattern, to draw boundaries and mark centers. To say this matters more than that, this is origin. This is destination. This is where we are. This is where we're going. This is how we understand the relationship between here and there, between us and the world, between the present and the paradise. We locate always at the edge, always in the east, always beyond reach, but always somehow still marked on the map, still given its place, still acknowledged as real even when reality itself seems insufficient to contain it. The candle flickers. The map waits on the table, and somewhere at its eastern edge, drawn in fading ink, Eden remains where it has always been, where it will always be, located and lost, mapped and mysterious, the garden we came from and cannot return to, the paradise we remember and cannot reach, the origin marked on every map that dares to show not just where we are, but where we began, where we long to be, where meaning suggests we belong even though exile insists we can never go back, can never cross the distance that separates the fallen world from the garden where God still walks in the cool of the evening, where the rivers still flow, where the tree of life still grows, waiting in its unreachable reality for the return that faith promises but geography denies, that maps acknowledge but cannot accomplish, that ink on vellum preserves as hope even when hope itself seems as distant, as impossible, as paradise drawn at the eastern edge of everything, located but forever lost, mapped but never reached, real but always, eternally, just beyond the world we can actually inhabit, the world we actually know, the world without Eden that nevertheless cannot stop remembering the garden, cannot stop mapping it, cannot stop drawing the rivers that flow from paradise, cannot stop orienting east toward the origin we cannot return to, but cannot stop believing in, cannot stop locating at the edge of every map that dares to show the world not just as it is, but as we remember it was, as we hope it might someday be again, when the exile ends and the return begins and the distance between the map and paradise finally closes. The bells that rang in empty towers, there is a sound echoing across a medieval town, and it is a sound that organizes everything. The bell rings from the tower, not the single flat tone that modern ears expect, but a voice with depth and character, with overtones that layer and shimmer in the air, with a timbre shaped by the bronze from which it was cast, by the size and thickness of the bell, by the skill of the founder who knew that sound was not merely function but presence, that a bell was not just signal, but soul, that its voice would call generations to prayer, would mark their hours, would announce their joys and sorrows, would become the auditory center around which communal life organized itself for centuries. The sound carries across rooftops and through narrow streets, reaching everyone simultaneously, creating synchronicity, binding the community in shared temporal experience. The merchant stops his bargaining mid-sentence. The farmer pauses in the field. The mother, nursing her child, looks up toward the tower. The entire town for this moment is united in listening, in acknowledging the call, in knowing what time it is, not by consulting private timepieces, but by hearing the public announcement, the voice from the tower saying without words, "This is the hour for vespers, for matins, for the angelus, for the moment when work stops and prayer begins, when the secular yields to the sacred, when individual concerns fade before communal obligation." This chapter explores what happened when the bells fell silent, when the voices that had governed time for centuries were stilled, when the towers stood empty and the bronze tongues ceased their calling, when time itself was transformed from something announced to something counted, from communal to individual, from sacred rhythm to secular measurement. The emotional journey follows sound as social fabric, examining how the silencing of bells marked not just technological change, but spiritual transformation, not just the replacement of one timekeeping method with another, but the dissolution of an entire way of organizing collective life around religious observance. On the assumption that time belonged to God, that hours were not neutral units but sacred appointments, that the day was structured not by work schedules, but by the liturgical round that bells announced, that called everyone to participate regardless of where they were, what they were doing, who they were. It is said that medieval people lived by bell time, that the hours were not abstract numbers, but named occasions, lauds prime terce sext, non vespers compline, the canonical hours that structured monastic life, but also through the bells that rang them structured the life of everyone within hearing, creating temporal framework that was simultaneously practical and sacred, that organized labor and prayer, that made time itself an act of worship, or at least an acknowledgement that the sacred had claims on the hours, that the day was not entirely ours to dispose of as we wished, but belonged also to God, who called us through bells to remember, to pause, to orient ourselves toward the eternal, even in the midst of the temporal. The opening image is acoustic, not visual but auditory, the sound of the bell rippling across the town, its waves moving through air and through consciousness, announcing without words what everyone knows how to read, what rhythm and pattern mean without needing translation, because the language of bells is learned from childhood, is absorbed through repetition, is carried in community memory that makes interpretation automatic, instinctive, shared. We explore now the semiotics of bells, the way that different patterns communicated different meanings, that created a vocabulary understood by everyone, that made sound into complex message capable of conveying not just time but occasion, not just hour but urgency or solemnity or celebration. The simple steady toll marking the hours, The rapid clanging warning of fire or invasion. The slow measured rhythm announcing death. The number of rings indicating whether the deceased was man or woman, child or adult, creating public obituary. Before newspapers, before telephones, before any technology of mass communication, except the bell that broadcast to everyone simultaneously the news that someone had died, that the community had lost a member, that mourning was required, that prayers should be offered. For births, a different pattern. Joyful, celebratory, the bells announcing arrival as they would later announce departure, bracketing life with sound, marking its beginning and end with bronze voices that said to the entire community, "Pay attention, something significant has occurred. Someone has entered or left our midst. The fabric of our shared life has been altered, and you need to know, need to acknowledge, need to adjust your understanding of who we are as community, because the membership has changed. Because birth and death are not private events, but communal transitions that affect everyone, that deserve public recognition, that merit the calling of bells." The atmosphere throughout is one of acoustic archaeology, of trying to imagine what the world sounded like when bells were the primary means of public communication, when their voices layered and overlapped, when a single town might hear bells from multiple churches, multiple towers, creating complex soundscape that modern silence has mostly erased, that we can reconstruct only partially through historical records and the occasional ringing that still occurs, usually for tourists, for nostalgia, for the performance of tradition, rather than its living practice. Beneath the silence of empty towers, we sense the magnitude of what was lost when bells ceased their daily calling, when the voices that had governed communal time for centuries were gradually retired, replaced by technologies that privatized timekeeping, that made each person responsible for knowing the hour through personal consultation of clocks and watches, rather than through collective listening to public announcement from the tower. Some believe the change began with mechanical clocks, with the development of reliable timekeeping devices that could mark hours with precision. Bells could not match. That could divide time into minutes and seconds, that could create schedules more detailed than the canonical hours allowed. The town clock in the square, still announcing hours with bell strikes. But now, the strikes were automatic, were triggered by mechanism rather than by human ringer, were precise to the minute rather than approximate, were divorced from liturgical time and connected instead to commercial time, to the time of merchants and markets, of departures and appointments, of schedules that required coordination more exact than bells alone could provide. And then personal timepieces, pocket watches first and then wristwatches, making each individual their own timekeeper, making public announcement of the hour less necessary, less authoritative, gradually making bells obsolete, reducing them from necessity to ornament, from governance of time to nostalgic reminder of time past, to tourist attraction, to occasional ringing for weddings or festivals, or the performance of tradition that is no longer tradition but memory of tradition, echo of the time when bells truly governed, truly called, truly structured the communal experience of time passing. What was lost in this transition? Not just the sound, though the silencing of bells did remove from the auditory landscape a voice that had been constant, that had been part of the fabric of daily experience, that had connected generations through its unchanged tone, its persistent calling, its reliable presence, marking the hours as they had been marked for centuries, as they would have continued to be marked if the technology of time had not shifted, if the understanding of time had not transformed from communal to individual, from sacred to secular, from announced to counted. But the deeper loss was in the way time was experienced, in the shift from time as shared to time as private, from time as call to time as measurement, from time as rhythm that everyone moved to simultaneously, to time as schedule that each person manages individually, consulting their own devices, making their own determinations about what the hour requires, no longer bound by the common call, no longer unified in the moment of listening, no longer synchronized by the voice from the tower that said to everyone at once, "Now, this moment, this is the time for vespers, for prayer, for pausing in your work, and remembering that time belongs not just to you but to God. Not just to labor, but to worship. Not just to the secular, but to the sacred. The chapter deepens now into the question of what happens to community when the mechanisms that create synchronicity are removed, when the technologies that bind people in shared temporal experience are replaced by technologies that enable individual time management, when the public announcement is replaced by private consultation, when everyone carries their own clock and therefore no longer needs to listen together, no longer needs to respond together, no longer needs to acknowledge the same moment as significant, because they are each tracking their own time, each managing their own schedule, each living in their own temporal framework that may coordinate with others through appointment, but no longer merges with others through shared response to the common call. Perhaps the silencing of bells is not unique, but representative. Perhaps it illustrates a larger pattern in which modernity consistently replaces collective experiences with individual ones, replaces public technologies with private ones, replaces shared rhythms with personal schedules, not from malice, but from the logic of efficiency, of precision, of control, making each person sovereign over their own time, but also isolated in their own time, no longer bound to others by the necessity of listening together, of responding together, of acknowledging together the moments that the bells marked as significant, as worthy of common attention, as requiring shared pause. We close now in silence, or rather in the modern noise that has replaced bell song, the constant hum of traffic and machinery, the intermittent alerts from personal devices, the soundscape of modernity that is not organized around any center, that has no towers from which authoritative voices call, that consists of overlapping private communications and background noise rather than the clear public announcement that used to organize collective life, that used to say to everyone, now, together, this moment matters, stop and listen. Acknowledge what time it is, not through private consultation, but through shared attendance, to the voice that calls from the tower, that speaks to everyone simultaneously, that creates community through the simple act of listening together to the same sound, marking the same moment. The towers still stand in many places, still contain their bells, but the bells mostly do not ring, or ring only occasionally, diminished from necessity to decoration, from governance to nostalgia, from the voice that structured daily life to the remnant that reminds us of a time when time itself was different, when hours were not just measurements but occasions, when the day was organized not by personal decision but by communal rhythm, when everyone knew what time it was not because they checked their watches but because they heard the bell, heard the call, heard the voice from the tower saying without words what everyone understood, what no one needed explained, what created synchronicity simply through the act of announcing, of calling, of ringing across the rooftops, until the sound reached everyone, until the community was united in the moment of listening, bound together by the voice that governed time, when time was not yet private, not yet individual, not yet something each person tracked alone, but was instead communal, sacred, announced from towers that still stand, but whose bells have fallen mostly silent, whose voices we hear now only as echo, only as memory, only as the ghost of what once organized everything, what once structured the day, what once called everyone to the same awareness of the same moment, creating community through sound, through rhythm, through the voice from the tower that said, now, this is the hour, stop and listen. Remember what time means. Remember that you are not alone in time, but are part of a community that moves through time together, that hears together, that responds together, that lives by the call of bells that rang in towers that are empty now, that are silent now, that stand as monuments to a time when time itself had a voice, when hours were called rather than counted, when the entire community lived by bell time, by the rhythm that came from above, by the voice that structured everything and is silent now, leaving only the towers, only the empty chambers where the bells hang unused, only the memory of what it meant when they rang. The bread they baked for the dead, there is bread resting on a gravestone, and steam is still rising from it. The loaf was baked this morning, carefully shaped, the dough kneaded by hands that remember how the deceased preferred it, not too dense, with just enough salt, the crust golden, but not burnt. It was carried here while still warm, placed with care on the stone that marks where the body lies, arranged as if on a table where someone might reach for it, might break off a piece, might savor the taste and warmth, might acknowledge through eating the love that went into the baking. But no hand reaches, no one breaks the bread. The steam rises into cold air and dissipates, and the loaf remains untouched, cooling slowly, becoming food that will not be eaten by the one for whom it was made, becoming offering that seems futile from any rational perspective, wasteful, illogical. The dedication of labor and resources to a recipient who cannot consume, who cannot acknowledge, who cannot reciprocate. Yet the gesture persists. Across cultures and centuries, the living have fed the dead, have brought offerings to tombs and graves, have placed meals at burial sites with care that suggests belief, or at least hope, that somehow in some way the dead receive what is given, that death has not severed the relationship entirely, that provision can continue, even when presence cannot, that care expressed through food remains meaningful even when the recipient cannot eat in any ordinary sense. The emotional arc follows this paradox, this tender contradiction of offering sustenance to those who have no mouths to taste it, no stomachs to digest it, no physical existence that requires nourishment, yet treating them as if they do, as if death has changed but not ended the relationship, as if what was obligation during life remains obligation after death, as if the bond between living and deceased requires maintenance, attention, the continuation of gestures that once sustained daily connection and now sustain memory, grief, love that persists beyond the boundary that death draws between the worlds. It is said that in ancient Egypt, the dead required sustenance for their journey through the afterlife, that without proper provision they would suffer hunger and thirst in the realm beyond, that the living bore responsibility for ensuring their ancestors were fed, were given the beer and bread and meat that would sustain them through eternity, or at least through the dangerous passage that followed death, through the weighing of the heart, through the trials that preceded arrival at the fields of reeds, where the blessed spent forever in prosperity, that nevertheless required food, required drink, required the offerings that relatives placed in tombs or at altars, that priests recited formulas to transform from material to spiritual sustenance, from physical bread to the essence of bread that the ka could consume, that the soul required as much as the body had. Tomb paintings show elaborate feasts, tables laden with offerings, servants bringing food and drink, the deceased seated in honor receiving provision that would continue as long as the living remembered to give it, as long as the funerary cult maintained its offerings, as long as someone came to the tomb and said the words that activated the painted food, that made the representations real in the way that mattered, that transformed image into essence, that fed the dead through ritual recitation, through the magical efficacy of words spoken with proper pronunciation, with correct ceremony, with the attention to detail that made the difference between effective and ineffective offering. The texts are explicit about what should be provided: 1,000 of bread, 1,000 of beer, 1,000 of oxen, 1,000 of fowl, the formulaic abundance that ensured the deceased would never lack, would never hunger, would spend eternity in prosperity, that the living maintained through their offerings, through their remembrance, through their refusal to let death mean abandonment, to let burial mean forgetting, to let the tomb become merely repository of bones rather than continuing residence of someone who still required care, still deserved provision, still participated in the family, even if invisibly, even if only through the offerings that arrived regularly, that kept them fed, that maintained their existence in the afterlife, that depended on the living to sustain it. Archaeological evidence confirms the practice. Food offerings found in burial chambers, vessels that once contained beer or wine, animal remains from ritual meals, bread baked specifically for placement in tombs. The material testimony to beliefs that seem strange from modern materialist perspective, but made perfect sense within frameworks that understood death differently, that saw the boundary between living and dead as permeable rather than absolute, that recognized obligations persisting beyond the point where they could be enforced, that treated care for the deceased as continuing duty rather than completed task. The atmosphere throughout is one of tender continuity, of the refusal to accept death as severance, of the insistence that relationship persists even when one party is invisible, is silent, is unable to reciprocate, is present only through memory and belief, and the offerings that acknowledge their continuing existence, even when that existence transcends ordinary perception. Some believe this was not merely superstition, not primitive error that modernity has corrected, of a different understanding of death, different conception of personhood that did not end with the cessation of biological function, that recognized the dead as transformed, but not obliterated, as absent from direct perception, but not absent from reality, as requiring different forms of interaction, but still capable of relationship, still deserving care, still owed the provision that family members give each other, that parents give children, and children eventually give parents. The reciprocity that structures kinship extending beyond the grave, because kinship itself was understood as transcending the merely physical, as binding souls, not just bodies, as creating obligations that death altered but did not eliminate. In medieval Europe, prayers for the dead were accompanied by almsgiving, by provision of food to the poor in the name of the deceased, creating economy of spiritual benefit where charity on earth translated to relief in purgatory, where the living could shorten the suffering of those they had lost through material offerings that had metaphysical effects, that changed the conditions of the dead through actions of the living, maintaining connection, expressing love, demonstrating that the bond persisted even when direct communication was impossible, even when the deceased could not thank those who gave on their behalf, even when the benefit was invisible, unverifiable, matters of faith, rather than fact. Beneath the silence of these practices, we sense the magnitude of what they reveal about human response to death, about the difficulty of accepting finality, about the ways that cultures create continuity where biology enforces rupture, about the need to do something to have agency, to transform the helplessness of grief into the activity of care, to maintain through offering the relationship that death threatens to sever, to refuse the passivity of mere mourning and claim instead the active role of provider, caretaker, the one who ensures the dead are not abandoned, not forgotten, not left to hunger even in realms where hunger may be metaphysical rather than physical. We deepen now into the question that haunts all such practices: who benefits? Do the dead actually receive sustenance? Does the bread placed on the grave feed anything except birds and insects? Does the prayer said for the deceased actually affect their condition in whatever existence follows death? Or does it only comfort the living, only provide the mourner with sense of continued connection, with feeling of agency, with ritual that allows grief to be expressed through action rather than paralyzed by sorrow? Perhaps both. Perhaps the practice serves the living through serving the dead. Perhaps the benefit flows in both directions. Perhaps the offering maintains relationship that exists as much in the heart of the giver as in the condition of the recipient. Perhaps what matters is not whether the dead literally consume the bread, but whether the living continue to care, continue to remember, continue to perform the gestures that say, "You are not forgotten, you are still part of us. Death has taken you from sight, but not from love, from memory, from the obligations we owe those who belong to us, who will always belong to us regardless of what boundaries separate us." The chapter closes now at the graveside where the bread that was placed hours ago is being discovered by birds, by insects, by the mechanisms of decay that will return it to soil, to nutrients that will feed plants, that will feed animals, that will feed humans, the cycle continuing, the offering becoming part of the web of life, even if it does not feed the specific dead for whom it was intended. The gesture not wasted, even if its recipient cannot consume in the way the living consume the bread, finding its way into the economy of existence, where nothing is truly lost, where what seems futile from one perspective serves purpose from another, where the offering to the dead becomes gift to the living world, where care expressed to the invisible sustains the visible, where the ritual maintains not just memory but ecology, not just relationship, but participation in the great reciprocity where the dead feed the living as much as the living feed the dead, where bread baked for those who have gone becomes sustenance for those who remain, becomes testimony to the continuity that transcends individual existence. That makes death transformation rather than ending, that insists through offering that the bond persists, that care continues, that what was given in life extends into death and beyond, that the gesture itself carries meaning regardless of whether the recipient receives in the way we receive, that sometimes the point is not efficacy, but faithfulness, not result, but relationship, not whether the dead are actually fed, but whether we continue trying to feed them, continue bringing bread to graves, continue placing offerings at altars, continue performing rituals that make no sense from materialist perspective, but make perfect sense from perspective that recognizes love as stronger than death, duty as transcending biological ending, relationship as persisting beyond the point where reciprocity is possible, where gratitude can be expressed, where the living hear any response except the silence that we fill with offerings, with prayers, with bread baked for the dead that feeds the living world, that sustains the cycle, that participates in the great exchange where nothing is wasted, where every gesture finds its recipient even if not the recipient intended, where the bread placed on graves today will be soil tomorrow, will be wheat the day after, will be bread again for the living who will someday be dead, and will receive their own offerings, will have bread placed on their graves by those who cannot accept that death means severance, who insist through ritual that relationship continues, who bake for the deceased because this is what love does. This is what memory requires. This is how we say to those who have gone, you are not forgotten, you are still fed. We still care, the bond persists, the offering continues, the bread is baked and brought and placed with hands that remember, that refuse to forget, that maintain through gesture what cannot be maintained through presence, that feed the dead. Because the dead are us, are who we will be, are those we love who have simply gone ahead, who wait in whatever existence waits, who receive or do not receive our offerings, but whose memory receives, whose place in our hearts receives, whose absence is filled by the bread we bake, by the meals we bring, by the continuation of care that says, death changes everything, but death does not end this, does not sever what binds us, does not eliminate the obligation to provide, to remember, to bring bread to graves where no one eats it in the ordinary way, but where somehow, in ways that transcend ordinary understanding, the offering matters, the gesture counts, the bread feeds something, even if not the body, feeds memory, feeds love, feeds the relationship that persists beyond the grave, beyond the silence, beyond the boundary that separates the living from the dead, but cannot separate the living from their need to continue caring, to continue providing, to continue baking bread for those who have gone, who are not entirely gone, as long as someone remembers, to bring them bread, to place it carefully on the stone, to arrange it as if someone might reach for it, might be pleased by the care taken, might receive through invisible means what visible means cannot deliver, might somehow, in ways we cannot verify, but refuse to stop believing, be fed by the bread we bake for the dead. The constellation they erased from the sky. There is a sky above you, and it is not what you think it is. Look up on a clear night, away from the electric glow that has stolen the stars from most of humanity, and you see patterns. The Big Dipper, Orion's belt, the W of Cassiopeia. Your eyes connect the dots automatically, drawing lines between points of light, creating shapes that have names, that carry stories, that feel natural, inevitable, as if the universe itself arranged these stars into recognizable forms. Rather than consciousness imposing order on chaos, rather than culture drawing boundaries that exist nowhere except in the collective agreement to see them, to name them, to pass them forward as if they were discoveries rather than inventions. But the constellations you recognize are not the only patterns that have been seen in these stars, not the original stories, not even the most ancient. They are the patterns that won, the interpretations that survived standardization, the cultural consensus that erased alternatives, that removed from star charts the constellations that other peoples drew, that deleted entire systems of celestial organization in favor of the 88 official patterns that modern astronomy recognizes, that have become so familiar, they seem natural, seem obvious, seem like the only way to organize the night sky into meaning. This chapter explores what was lost in that standardization. What constellations were erased? What stories were deleted? What ways of seeing were replaced by the dominant pattern that now seems universal, but is actually recent, actually cultural, actually the result of decisions made by specific people at specific times for specific reasons that had as much to do with politics and colonialism and the consolidation of European astronomical authority as they had to do with the actual arrangement of stars in the actual sky. The emotional journey follows the recognition that the sky itself has been colonized, that celestial cartography became contested territory, that what seems most natural and unchanging, the patterns we see in stars, are actually cultural constructs, are actually interpretations that vary across time and place, are actually stories we tell rather than facts we discover, are projections of consciousness onto the cosmic void that reveals as much about us as it does about the universe we claim to be mapping. It is said that the International Astronomical Union standardized the constellations in 1922, drawing precise boundaries between them, eliminating overlap and ambiguity, creating a system where every point in the sky belonged to exactly one constellation, where the traditional asterisms were supplemented by modern inventions to fill gaps, where southern hemisphere stars that had no classical names were organized into new constellations commemorating scientific instruments and exotic animals, creating artificial constructs that had no mythological depth, no cultural resonance, no stories except the story of European exploration and scientific categorization imposing order on the celestial sphere. But before this standardization, the sky was more various, more contested, more layered with alternative interpretations. Different cultures saw different patterns in the same stars, drew different lines connecting different points, told different stories about what the configurations represented, created different systems for organizing the overwhelming multiplicity of visible stars into memorable, meaningful, navigable patterns. The opening image is simple: you, looking up, trying to see not what you have been taught to see, but what might be there, what alternative patterns might emerge if you could unsee the familiar constellations, if you could let your eyes wander without the guidance of names and stories learned in childhood, if you could encounter the night sky fresh, as ancient observers did, before the patterns solidified into tradition, before consensus became constraint, before one way of organizing the stars eliminated all others. We explore now specific lost constellations, patterns that were recognized, named, used for navigation or calendar keeping or myth-telling, but that have been erased from modern star charts, that survive only in historical texts, in archaeological evidence, in the maintenance of traditional knowledge by cultures that resisted the standardization, that continued seeing their own patterns despite the official consensus that those patterns were obsolete, were incorrect, were not really constellations at all but only local traditions that deserved no place in the universal system. Chinese astronomy divided the sky differently than Greek tradition, organized stars into lunar mansions that tracked the moon's monthly journey through the heavens, created a system that emphasized different relationships between stars, that drew boundaries in different places, that told stories reflecting Chinese mythology rather than Mediterranean myth, that served the needs of Chinese calendar making and astrology rather than Greek navigation and cosmology. These patterns were not wrong, were not inferior, were simply different, were alternative ways of organizing the same physical reality to cultural meaning, into practical utility, into the frameworks that allowed communities to track time, to navigate space, to tell stories that connected heaven to earth, that made the vast, impersonal cosmos into something familiar, meaningful, related to human concerns. Aboriginal Australian astronomy emphasized dark constellations, patterns formed not by stars, but by the dark patches between them, by the dust clouds and voids that created shapes in the Milky Way, recognizing that absence could be as meaningful as presence, that the space between stars was not empty, but full of significance, that the sky told stories not just through light, but through shadow, through the places where light did not reach, through the dark emu that stretched across the galactic center, through patterns that European eyes did not see because they had been trained to connect bright points, to ignore the darkness, to treat absence as merely absence rather than as form, as pattern, as constellation in its own right. Medieval European astronomy recognized constellations that modern charts have eliminated: smaller asterisms, local variants, patterns that served particular purposes for particular communities, but that were deemed unnecessary when standardization prioritized universal applicability over local relevance. When the goal became creating a single system that everyone would use rather than maintaining the diversity of systems that different cultures had developed, that different needs had shaped, that different skies, different latitudes, different seasons, different purposes had made meaningful. The atmosphere throughout is one of recovery attempt, of trying to see through layers of learned interpretation to something more fundamental, more multiple, more open to alternative organization. Because the difficulty is not just that the lost constellations have been erased from charts, the difficulty is that they have been erased from consciousness, that we have been trained so thoroughly to see the familiar patterns that seeing alternatives requires effort, requires intentional unseeing, requires recognizing that the lines we draw between stars are not discoveries but impositions, not revelations of natural order, but creations of cultural need. Some believe that every constellation is metaphor, is parable, is attempt to make the incomprehensible comprehensible, to make the vast intimate, to make the inhuman meaningful by projecting human and animal forms onto arrangements of light that care nothing for our categories that exist in configurations determined by physics and chance, that form patterns only because we are pattern-seeking creatures, because we cannot help but organize chaos into meaning, because we need the sky to tell us stories, to give us guidance, to reflect back our concerns, even though the stars themselves are indifferent, are blind to our interpretations, are simply burning in their orbits, their light reaching us across distances so vast that many of the stars we see tonight are already dead, their light still traveling toward us from their ancient positions, making the night sky a museum of ghosts, of extinct suns whose patterns we preserve long after the patterns themselves have dissolved. Beneath the silence of the night sky, we sense the magnitude of what was lost when diversity was replaced by standardization, when multiple ways of seeing were reduced to single, official interpretation, when the sky itself was colonized, was organized according to European astronomical tradition. That became universal, not because it was better, but because it was backed by institutional power, by international agreement, by the apparatus of modern science that required standardization, that needed consensus, that could not tolerate the ambiguity of multiple systems, the confusion of different patterns, the diversity of interpretations that made the sky rich, but also complex, meaningful, but also contested. What was lost? Not just the alternative patterns themselves, though those are lost enough, the specific groupings of stars that other cultures recognized, that served their needs, that carried their stories, but also the entire systems that depended on those patterns. Navigation methods that used different star groupings as guides, calendar systems that tracked different asterisms through the seasons, mythologies that explained the placement and movement of constellations that no longer officially exist, agricultural timing that depended on the rising and setting of stars we no longer name, religious observances timed to celestial events defined by patterns we no longer recognize, and deeper still, the loss of the understanding that there is no one correct way to organize the sky, that constellations are cultural artifacts, not natural facts, that the patterns we see are projections, not discoveries, that every system of celestial organization is simultaneously true. It uses actual stars in actual positions, and invented the connections between them exist only in consciousness, that astronomy and culture are inseparable, even when astronomy claims to be objective, claims to be universal, claims to have transcended the local, the traditional, the particular, in favor of the global, the scientific, the standard. We close now under the night sky, attempting the impossible, trying to unsee the familiar patterns, to let the stars be simply lights again, before we impose the constellations we know, before we connect the dots according to the official system, before we reduce the overwhelming multiplicity to the manageable categories that make navigation possible, but that also constrain perception, that make it difficult to see what is not already named, what is not already mapped, What exists outside the boundaries that have been drawn, the lines that have been established, the patterns that have been standardized into the only patterns we recognize. The stars shine in their ancient positions, imperceptibly drifting over timescales that make human history insignificant, that make our constellations temporary regardless of how permanent they seem. The light that reaches us tonight left those stars decades, or centuries, or millennia ago, making every observation an encounter with the past, making the night sky a canvas of ghosts, of extinct suns still visible, still part of the patterns we draw, still contributing to constellations that organize them into stories, into guides, into frameworks for making meaning from the overwhelming multitude of lights that fill the darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, the erased constellations wait not in the stars themselves, which are indifferent to our patterns, but in the possibility of seeing differently, of drawing alternative lines, of remembering that the stories we tell about the sky are not the only stories that could be told, are not discoveries, but inventions, are not facts, but interpretations that reveal as much about the interpreters as about what is interpreted. Perhaps that is the wisdom here, not to recover the specific lost constellations, though that work is valuable, is necessary, is the project of cultural astronomy that tries to preserve traditional knowledge before it disappears entirely, but to recognize that every constellation is loss and gain both, is choice that emphasizes certain patterns while erasing others, is organization that makes navigation possible, but that also constrains perception, that gives us familiar stories, but that costs us alternative narratives, that provides consensus, but eliminates diversity, that makes the sky legible but also controlled, mapped but also colonized, standardized but also impoverished. The stars continue their ancient dance, indifferent to our patterns, to our stories, to the lines we draw between them. The constellations we recognize are real in the sense that they use actual stars, but they are also invented, are also cultural, are also one way among many of organizing the chaos of light into meaning, into memory, into the patterns that make the night sky comprehensible, that make the universe feel less empty, less indifferent, less vast and cold and hostile to human meaning. And the constellations we erased are still there, potentially, waiting in the same stars, ready to be seen again if we can learn to look differently, if we can unsee what we have been taught, if we can recognize that the patterns we know are not the patterns, but only patterns, that the sky contains infinities of potential organization, that every culture that has ever looked up has seen something different, has drawn different lines, has told different stories, has created different ways of making the overwhelming multiplicity of stars into something manageable, something memorable, something that connects the human to the cosmic, the earthly to the heavenly, the temporary to the eternal. The night deepens, the stars shine on, and somewhere in the space between the lights and the darkness, that is not empty, but full in the potential that exists before we impose pattern, the erased constellations wait patient as starlight, ready to return if we are ready to see them, if we are willing to recognize that what we call sky is always interpretation, always choice, always the imposition of human meaning onto inhuman vastness, always both necessary and arbitrary, always both true and invented, always both discovered in the stars and created in the consciousness that looks up and cannot help but see patterns, cannot help but draw lines, cannot help but tell stories about the lights and the darkness, stories that are simultaneously about the stars and about ourselves, about the universe and about the cultures that observe it, about what is there and about what we project there, about the constellations that exist in the sky and the constellations that exist only in the human need to organize chaos, to impose meaning, to make the vast comprehensible by drawing it down to human scale, by giving it names and stories and patterns that make it feel less alien, less indifferent, less overwhelming in its infinite complexity and its absolute silence, and its eternal presence that outlasts every culture that has ever looked up and seen in the same stars different patterns, different stories, different constellations that reflect different ways of being human, different ways of finding meaning, different ways of organizing the night sky into the forms that matter, that guide, that teach, that connect us to something larger than ourselves, even as we project ourselves onto it, even as we draw the constellations that we then claim to discover, that we then standardize, that we then use to erase the alternatives, forgetting that every constellation is both gift and theft, both creation and destruction, both the pattern we see and all the patterns we have learned not to see, that wait in the same stars, that shine in the same sky, that could be seen again, and we could remember that the lines between stars are not fixed, are not natural, are not the only way, are not the true way, are simply our way. The patterns we chose, the stories we tell, the constellations we recognize until we forget they were ever chosen, ever told, ever recognized, rather than simply discovered, simply there, simply the way the sky is, rather than the way we have decided, collectively, culturally, historically, to organize it, to see it, to draw the patterns that make it ours, that erase the patterns that made it theirs, that standardize the diversity into unity, that replace the many with the few, that give us consensus at the cost of alternative, that give us the constellations we know by erasing the constellations they knew that still exist potentially in the same stars, waiting to be seen again, waiting for the unseeing that might allow new seeing, waiting in the darkness between the lights, in the space where pattern has not yet formed, where the stars are still just stars, still lights in darkness, still infinite possibility before we draw the lines, before we tell the stories, before we create the constellations that we will then forget we created, that we will then believe we discovered, that we will then defend as the only truth, the only way, the only patterns worth recognizing in the vast and silent sky that holds them all, the constellations we know and the constellations we have forgotten, the patterns we draw and the patterns we erase, the stories we tell and the stories we silence, all existing potentially in the same stars, all waiting in the darkness, all shining still. The ceremony they performed in perfect darkness. There is a chamber deep underground where all light has been extinguished, and the darkness is so complete that it has weight, texture, presence. This is not the darkness of nighttime, not the shadow that streetlights diminish or that moonlight softens. This is absolute black, the perfect absence of photons, the condition that modern life has almost eliminated, that we experience now only in caves deep enough that no surface light penetrates, in chambers sealed against every crack through which illumination might leak. This is the darkness our ancestors knew, that they created deliberately, that they used as sacred technology, as tool for transformation, as necessary condition for experiences that could not occur in light, that required precisely this deprivation, this elimination of the sense that usually dominates consciousness, this forced reliance on other ways of knowing. Stand in such darkness, and after the first moments of disorientation, after the eyes stop trying to adjust to light levels that do not exist, something shifts. The body recalibrates, the mind reorganizes, the usual hierarchy of senses inverts, and what was background becomes foreground, sound grows vivid, touch becomes primary, smell carries information you never noticed when vision was available, and time itself changes, becomes uncertain, becomes elastic, because without visual cues the markers that usually structure temporal experience disappear, leaving consciousness floating in duration that might be minutes or hours, that stretches and compresses in ways that light-dependent timekeeping cannot capture. This chapter explores darkness as sacred technology, examining how mystery cults and initiatory traditions across cultures used absolute darkness, not as punishment or deprivation, but as method, as way of creating conditions for knowledge that comes through blindness, for understanding that vision obstructs, for transformation that requires the elimination of sight as prerequisite for deeper seeing. The emotional arc follows the descent into darkness as spiritual discipline, the recognition that some truths cannot be seen but must be experienced, that the eyes sometimes mislead where the heart might guide, that in the absence of external light, internal illumination becomes possible, becomes necessary. It becomes the only way to navigate space that has become simultaneously physical and metaphysical, simultaneously the chamber you occupy and the inner landscape that darkness reveals. It is said that the Eleusinian mysteries, conducted for 2,000 years in the same sanctuary outside Athens, culminated in a ceremony performed in darkness, in the Telesterion, where initiates gathered after days of fasting and preparation, after walking the sacred way, after purification in the sea, after experiences designed to prepare them for what would occur in that final night, in that darkened hall where something was revealed that could not be spoken of afterward, that thousands experienced but none betrayed in any surviving text. That remained secret, not just because revelation was forbidden, but perhaps because what occurred in darkness could not be adequately described in light, could not be translated into language that depended on visual metaphor, could not be communicated to those who had not undergone the darkness themselves. What happened there, we do not know. We cannot know, because the silence holds. But we know it occurred in darkness, know that the absence of light was not incidental, but essential, that what was revealed required blindness, that the initiation into the mysteries depended on the elimination of sight, on the creation of conditions where consciousness encountered something that could not be seen, but could be experienced, that transformed those who underwent it, but could not be captured in words that would make sense to those who remained in the light. The opening image is spatial. You are in the chamber, deep underground, the passage behind you sealed, the darkness so complete that your hand before your face is invisible, that the difference between eyes open and eyes closed becomes meaningless, that the visual field provides nothing, offers no information, leaves consciousness dependent on other senses, on touch and sound, and the kinesthetic awareness of where your body is in space, even when space itself has become invisible, has dissolved into the darkness that is everywhere, that is everything. That is all that exists in this moment of deprivation, that is simultaneously terrifying and liberating, simultaneously loss and opportunity. We explore now historical practices, other traditions that understood darkness as more than absence, that recognized it as presence, as force, as sacred space where transformation occurred. The Mithraic mysteries conducted initiations in caves, in underground spaces where devotees of the solar god paradoxically gathered in darkness, where the bull was slain symbolically, where levels of initiation were marked by ordeals. We can only partially reconstruct from the archaeological remains, from the chambers that still exist, though empty now, their darkness no longer sacred, but merely dark, their ceremonies ceased, their transformative power dissolved, or perhaps dormant, waiting for those who would understand what darkness offers, what sight obscures, what can be learned only when the eyes cannot see. Vision quests in indigenous traditions sometimes involved sensory deprivation, isolation in darkness, where the seeker fasted and waited for the vision that would guide their adult life, that would reveal their purpose, their medicine, their particular gift and burden. The darkness was not obstacle, but facilitator, was not punishment, but preparation, creating conditions where ordinary consciousness could not maintain its usual patterns, where the predictable gave way to the unpredictable, where something other than the everyday self could emerge, could speak, could offer guidance that came not from external authority, but from depths that darkness allowed access to, that light kept hidden, that vision suppressed. The atmosphere throughout must be disorienting, vertiginous, capturing the particular vulnerability of being sightless in unknown space, of being dependent on guides whose faces you cannot see, whose expressions you cannot read, whose intentions you must trust, because you cannot verify, because in the darkness, all authority becomes invisible, becomes voice without body, becomes direction without ability to confirm, becomes trust that must be absolute, because no other option exists. Some believe that ritual darkness affects consciousness in measurable ways, that the elimination of visual input changes brain activity, that in the absence of external images, the mind generates its own, that visions arise not from outside, but from within, that the darkness becomes screen onto which consciousness projects what it needs to see, what it needs to confront, what transformation requires as catalyst. The hallucinations or visions or revelations that occur in prolonged darkness might be neurological responses to sensory deprivation, but that explanation does not diminish their significance. does not make them less real to those who experience them, does not reduce the transformation that follows from encountering in darkness what could not be encountered in light. Beneath the silence of these darkened chambers, we sense the magnitude of what was attempted, the ambition to create experiences that would permanently alter those who underwent them, that would make initiates into different people, that would through darkness and ordeal and revelation forge bonds stronger than kinship, create knowledge deeper than information, produce transformation that no amount of instruction in the light could achieve. We deepen now into the phenomenology of ritual darkness, into how it affects the experience of time, of space, of self. In darkness, duration becomes uncertain. Without the visual cues that usually mark the passage of time, the movement of shadows, the changing angle of light, the activities of others' consciousness loses its usual temporal anchors. Minutes might be hours, hours might be minutes. The ceremony might last all night or might be completed in moments. The darkness makes time itself mysterious, makes it subjective, makes it something experienced rather than measured, felt rather than counted. Sound in darkness becomes vivid, becomes the primary sense, becomes the way you track others in the space, becomes the information you rely on when sight provides nothing. A voice in darkness has different quality than voice in light, more intimate perhaps, or more authoritative, or more mysterious because you cannot see the speaker, cannot verify their expression, must trust the sound alone without visual confirmation, must surrender to the guidance that comes through words spoken in space you cannot see, by someone you cannot observe. And touch becomes primary when sight is eliminated, becomes the sense you trust, becomes how you know where you are, where others are, what the space contains. The walls you cannot see but can feel, the floor beneath your feet, the presence of others marked by breath, by warmth, by the slight sounds of movement, by the displacement of air that tells you someone is near though you cannot see them, though the darkness hides all visual evidence, though you must trust other senses, older senses, perhaps senses that sight has made secondary, but that darkness restores to primacy. The chapter approaches now its culmination, its moment of emergence, the transition from darkness into light that ancient initiates experienced as rebirth, as transformation, as the completion of the journey that required darkness as necessary stage, as passage that could not be avoided, as ordeal that proved commitment and prepared consciousness for what would follow, for the knowledge that came after darkness, for the identity that emerged from the chamber different than the identity that entered, for the transformation that made you one of those who knew, who had undergone, who carried in memory the experience of darkness that could not be communicated but could be recognized, that created bonds with all others who had been through the same darkness, who had experienced the same deprivation, who had learned whatever lessons darkness teaches. Imagine it, after hours in absolute black, the first light. Not sudden, perhaps, but gradual, a dim glow at first, then brightening, then the slow return of sight, the restoration of the sense that had been eliminated, the world coming back, but coming back change. Or perhaps you are change, perhaps what darkness taught remains even as light returns, perhaps the transformation persists, perhaps you see differently now. Perhaps the light itself seems different after the darkness, seems precious, seems gift, seems something you will never again take for granted, because you have experienced its absence, have felt what it means when light disappears entirely, when darkness is all that exists, when sight provides nothing and other ways of knowing must suffice. We close contemplating what can only be learned in the absence of sight, what truths arrive when the eyes cannot see. When external vision is eliminated and internal vision must develop, must emerge, must provide guidance that light-dependent consciousness cannot access. Perhaps in darkness we meet ourselves, the self that exists beneath the surfaces that light reveals, beneath the presentations that vision makes possible, beneath the identities that depend on being seen. Perhaps in darkness we confront what we usually avoid, what light lets us escape, what sight allows us to deny. Perhaps darkness is not deprivation, but revelation, not loss, but gift, not absence, but presence of something that light obscures, that vision suppresses, that can emerge only when the dominance of sight is eliminated, when consciousness is forced to reorganize. when the usual hierarchies invert, and what was background becomes foreground, and what was invisible becomes the only reality, the only truth, the only knowledge that matters. The ceremony ends. The light returns. The initiates emerge, blinking, transformed, carrying what darkness taught back into the world of light, carrying the memory of absolute black back into the realm of vision, carrying the knowledge that came through blindness back into the life that depends on sight. They do not speak of what occurred. They cannot speak of it, perhaps because language itself depends too much on visual metaphor, because words cannot capture what darkness reveals, because the experience belongs to those who underwent it, and cannot be transmitted to those who remained in light, who never descended into the chamber, who never experienced the absolute black that is simultaneously terrifying and liberating, simultaneously deprivation and revelation, simultaneously loss and discovery. The darkness waits still, in chambers beneath the earth, in caves that have never seen sunlight, in spaces we could enter if we chose, if we dared, if we understood what the ancients understood, that darkness is not merely absence of light but presence of something else, something that light obscures, something that can be encountered only when sight is eliminated, when consciousness is freed from the dominance of vision, when the darkness is so complete that eventually it stops feeling like darkness and becomes simply the medium of existence, the element in which transformation occurs, the sacred space where knowledge comes not through seeing but through being, through surrendering to the black, through trusting in process that cannot be observed, through allowing the darkness to do its work, to strip away what light makes possible, to reveal what only darkness can show, to transform through deprivation, through ordeal, through the elimination of sight that makes other sight possible, deeper sight, truer sight, the vision that comes only through blindness, only through darkness, only through the absolute black that was always sacred, was always necessary, was always the chamber where the ceremony occurred, where transformation happened, where those who dared the darkness emerged, changed, reborn, initiated into mysteries that light could not reveal, that sight could not discover, that required the elimination of vision as prerequisite for understanding, as condition for knowledge, as necessary. Darkness before the light could return with meaning restored, with sight renewed, with the world seen differently, because darkness had taught what light alone could never teach, had revealed what vision could only obscure, had provided the transformation that could occur only in perfect darkness, in absolute black, in the sacred chamber, where all light was extinguished, and the ceremony began. The bridge they built to cross forever. There is a bridge standing over a river in Europe, and it has been standing for 2,000 years. The stones are worn smooth by centuries of passage, Roman sandals, medieval carts, modern automobiles, all crossing the same arches, all trusting the same foundations, all depending on engineering decisions made by minds that have been dust since the empire fell, since the legions withdrew, since Latin ceased to be the language of administration and became merely the root from which other languages grew, transforming but carrying forward the words the bridge builders spoke when they planned these arches, calculated these spans, drove these foundations deep into the riverbed, where they have remained stable and solid for longer than most civilizations endure. Stand on the bridge and feel the stone beneath your feet. This is not reconstruction. This is not replica. These are the actual stones that Roman engineers placed here, that Roman laborers shaped and fitted, that have borne the weight of traffic for 2 millennia, that have survived floods that washed away everything else, wars that destroyed the cities the bridge connected, the slow patient erosion that claims all works of human hands, but could not claim these arches, could not undermine these foundations, could not break what was built with such skill, such ambition, such confidence that what they made would last not just their lifetimes, but forever, or as close to forever as stone and engineering could achieve. The emotional journey follows this dual recognition of hubris and achievement, of the audacity to build for eternity, to assume that your engineering will outlast your civilization, to create infrastructure for descendants you will never meet, who will speak languages you cannot imagine, who will worship gods you do not recognize, who will organize their societies in ways you cannot predict, but who will still need to cross rivers, who will still benefit from the bridge you built, who will walk on the same stones, trust the same arches, depend on the same engineering that has become invisible through familiarity, that functions so reliably it is taken for granted, that continues its purpose with such quiet competence that we forget it is testimony to ambition so vast. It dared to build not for a generation, but for all generations, not for the present, but for the perpetual present that would arrive century after century, millennium after millennium. As long as the stone endured, as long as the arches stood, as long as the river flowed beneath spans that would carry across it every successive wave of humanity that needed to reach the other side. It is said that Roman engineers understood permanence in ways we have largely forgotten, that their infrastructure was designed not for the typical lifespan or the expected useful period, but for indefinite duration, for the assumption that what they built should simply not fail, should not require replacement, should become part of the permanent landscape. As much a feature of geography as the river itself, as the hills the roads traversed as the mountains, the aqueducts crossed as the terrain itself, which Roman engineering reorganized, restructured, made more navigable, more useful, more suited to the purposes of civilization that assumed itself eternal, that could not imagine its own ending, that built as if Rome would last forever, and so the bridges must last forever too, must serve the eternal city and its eternal provinces, must carry traffic across rivers that would always need crossing, that would always separate territories that needed connection, that would always be obstacles that engineering could transform into thoroughfares, that could be made to serve rather than hinder, that could be spanned by arches that would outlast everything except the river itself. The opening image is physical, immediate, you standing on the bridge, the stone solid beneath you, the river flowing below, the arches framing water that has flowed here since before the bridge existed, that will flow here after the bridge is gone, if the bridge is ever gone, if the engineering ever fails, if the 2,000 years that have not destroyed it are followed by centuries that do, though there is no sign yet, no indication that what has lasted so long is near its end, no evidence that the bridge is weakening, failing, approaching the limit of its endurance. It seems standing here as if it could last another 2,000 years, as if the ambition that built for eternity was not hubris, but realistic assessment of what stone and engineering can achieve when skill and resources and will converge when a civilization decides to build something that will outlast itself, that will serve peoples it will never know, that will become inheritance for futures it cannot imagine. We explore now the engineering that enabled such permanence, the specific technical decisions that made the difference between construction that lasted decades and construction that lasted millennia. The arch, first, that elegant solution to the problem of spanning space, that distributes weight along curved surfaces rather than concentrating it in straight beams, that allows stone to bridge distances that would defeat simpler designs, that create structures inherently stable, inherently self-supporting, that require no tensile strength in their materials because the forces are all compressive, are all pushing stone against stone in ways that stone handles perfectly, that exploit the strength of the material rather than demanding properties it does not possess. The foundations, driven deep into riverbed, reaching below the depth that seasonal floods would scour, anchored in bedrock or in layers of earth that would not shift, that would not settle, that would provide permanent support for the permanent structure rising above. The Romans understood that what shows above water depends entirely on what lies beneath, that the visible bridge rests on invisible foundations, that the arch everyone sees and praises depends on supports no one observes, that engineering is not just about the structure, but about the relationship between structure and earth, about connecting what humans build to what the earth provides, about making the artificial natural, the temporary permanent, the ambitious real. The materials chosen for durability, not just any stone, but the specific stones that would resist weathering, that would not crack with frost, that would not dissolve in rain, that would maintain their shape and strength across centuries. The design that accommodated flood by including multiple arches, by keeping the openings large enough that ice and debris could pass through rather than accumulating, rather than damming the flow, rather than creating pressure that would undermine the structure. The Romans built not just for normal conditions, but for extremes, for the 100-year flood, for the exceptional ice jam, for the rare but inevitable moments when the river becomes destructive force rather than gentle flow, when the bridge must endure not just weight above, but assault below, must survive not just traffic, but catastrophe. The atmosphere throughout is one of temporal up, of vertigo before duration, of the recognition that we walk on the same surfaces ancient feet walked, that there is no gap between then and now because the bridge connects them, makes them continuous, makes the 2,000 years separating construction from current use into single span of continuous function, continuous service, continuous presence of the structure that has simply been here performing its purpose, doing what it was built to do for longer than the English language has existed, for longer than most nations have existed, for longer than most religions in their current forms have existed, standing patiently, carrying traffic, connecting shores, serving whoever needs to cross, regardless of language, citizenship, belief, era, connecting everyone to everyone who came before and everyone who will come after. Through this shared physical space, this actual stone, this inheritance we use every time we cross from one bank to the other. Some believe that using infrastructure we did not build creates particular kind of humility, particular recognition of debt to past, of dependence on those who came before, a connection to deep history that is not merely abstract but concrete, is not merely story but structure, is not merely memory but material reality we encounter, we walk on, we drive across, we trust without thinking because it has proven trustworthy, because it has lasted longer than empires, because the engineering that created it exceeded the politics that commissioned it, transcended the civilization that built it, became legacy that outlasted the Rome that made it, that passed to peoples the Romans conquered or never reached, that became European infrastructure, human infrastructure, the bridges we all use, regardless of who built them, who commissioned them, who designed them, who no longer exist, but whose works persist, whose engineering continues functioning, whose ambition achieved the eternity it sought, or something close enough to eternity for any human scale, any meaningful duration, any span that matters to societies that rise and fall within the endurance of a single bridge, within the service life of a single span, within the functional persistence of arches that simply do not fail, that simply continue bearing weight, that simply endure. Beneath the silence of the river's flow, we sense the paradox of using what we inherit without building, of benefiting from ambition we did not conceive, of living within infrastructure that predates our societies, our languages, our assumptions about how the world works. That comes from a time when different assumptions prevailed, when different ambitions were possible, when it was conceivable to build for eternity, to create infrastructure intended to last forever, to commit resources to permanence rather than to planned obsolescence, to design for indefinite duration rather than for replacement cycles, to make things that would not need to be made again because they would simply not fail, would simply persist, would simply become part of the permanent landscape that each generation would inherit and use and pass forward, would maintain but not replace, would repair but not rebuild, would depend on but not recreate. Because the original remained functional, remained adequate, remained so well designed and well built that improvement was unnecessary, replacement was unthinkable, continuation was the only reasonable response to infrastructure that simply did not fail. We deepen into questions about what this means, what it reveals about the Romans, and about us, what it says about civilization and engineering, about ambition and inheritance, about building for the future and inheriting from the past. Did the Romans know they were building for us? Did they imagine that 2,000 years hence, peoples they never heard of would still be using their bridges, would still be depending on their engineering, would still be benefiting from their infrastructure? Or did they simply build for themselves, for their own time, with such skill and such durability that permanence was side effect rather than goal, was achievement rather than intention, was what happened when you built as well as you could with the best materials and engineering available, when you didn't skimp, didn't compromise, didn't accept good enough, but demanded excellent, demanded durable, demanded engineering that would not fail even when tested by time, even when subjected to 2 millennia of use, even when carrying loads never imagined, serving purposes never conceived, functioning in contexts utterly transformed from the moment of construction. Perhaps both. Perhaps the ambition for permanence was explicit, was part of Roman identity, was expression of the conviction that Rome was eternal, and so Roman works must be eternal too. But perhaps also the durability was simply what happened when engineering excellence met adequate resources, met political will that supported long-term thinking, that was willing to invest in infrastructure that would not pay for itself in a single generation, that would not be completed in a single reign. That required patience, foresight, the willingness to build for descendants, to create for the future, to leave behind something that would outlast the builders, that would become their legacy, their testimony, their gift to all who came after. The chapter closes at twilight, the day fading, the light turning golden, and then amber, and then that deep blue that precedes night, the bridge darkening, becoming silhouette against the sky, becoming shadow over water that reflects the last light, becoming the enduring thing, the permanent structure around which the day and the night and the seasons and the centuries revolve, around which civilizations rise and fall, around which languages come and go, around which the entire human pageant moves, while the bridge simply stands, simply continues, simply performs its function with the quiet competence that comes from engineering so excellent, it becomes invisible, that works so well it is taken for granted, that lasts so long, it seems like it was always here, that it will always be here, like it is more geography than architecture, more part of nature than of culture, more stone than structure, more enduring than anything human has a right to be, but nevertheless is, has been, continues to be. 2,000 years and counting, carrying traffic, connecting shores, spanning the river that has not changed its course, that flows beneath arches that have not fallen, that channels through openings that Roman engineers calculated, that Roman builders constructed, that Roman ambition created, and that we inherit, we use, we depend on every time we cross the bridge. They built not just for themselves, but for forever, just for their time, but for all time. Not just for Rome, but for whoever would need to cross this river, whoever would need this bridge, whoever would come after the empire fell, and the language changed, and the civilization that built it transformed into civilizations the builders could not imagine, but whose need to cross rivers, whose dependence on infrastructure, whose gratitude for engineering that endures, would connect them across 2 millennia to the moment when the first stone was laid, when the foundations were driven, when the arches were built, when the bridge began its service that has not yet ended, that shows no sign of ending, that continues as if the 2,000 years were nothing, were merely the beginning, were just the first phase of endurance, that might stretch forward as far as it has already reached back, forward into futures we cannot imagine, carrying peoples we cannot conceive, serving purposes we cannot predict, but serving, enduring, continuing as the bridge has always continued, as perhaps it will always continue, as long as the stone holds, as long as the engineering functions, as long as there are rivers to cross and people who need to cross them, and this bridge standing where it has stood for 2,000 years, waiting patiently for the next crossing, the next generation, the next millennium of service, the next span of its endurance that has already outlasted everything except the river itself, the water that flows beneath, the current that passes under arches that do not pass, that remain, that stand as testament to the ambition that dared to build for eternity, and achieve something close enough that the difference hardly matters, close enough that standing on the bridge at twilight, watching day become night, watching the river flow beneath stone that has channeled it for 2,000 years, you understand that permanence is possible, that some things can be built to last, that the bridge is proof, is evidence, is reality beneath your feet, is stone you can touch, is engineering you can trust, is inheritance you can use, is gift from past to future, is testament to the builders who imagined forever and built something that has lasted long enough to make forever seem plausible, achievable, real. The silence they vowed to keep forever. There is a monastery where the day begins and ends in silence, and the hours between hold only the necessary words, The bell rings for lauds, for the first prayer before dawn, and the monks rise from their cells and walk to the chapel through corridors where no one speaks, where footsteps echo softly on stone floors that have absorbed centuries of this same quiet procession, this gathering of men who have chosen to live most of their lives without the constant stream of words that fills the world beyond these walls, who have exchanged conversation for contemplation, speech for silence, the verbal exchanges that usually structure human connection for something else, something that exists in the space between utterances, in the awareness that emerges when speaking stops. This is not the silence of isolation. This is not the quiet of abandonment. This is deliberate silence, chosen silence. Silence practiced as spiritual discipline, as method for transformation, as way of creating conditions where something can be heard that the constant noise of talking usually drowns, where something can emerge that the verbal mind usually suppresses, where consciousness can encounter itself stripped of the linguistic frameworks that usually mediate every experience, that usually translate the world into words, before we have even finished perceiving it. The emotional arc follows silence as method rather than punishment, the recognition that speaking less might enable hearing more, that the reduction of outward communication might facilitate inward attention, that quiet creates conditions different from noise, valuable precisely in their difference, offering access to dimensions of experience that remain unavailable when speech dominates, when the tongue never rests, when the mind never stops generating the verbal narration that typically accompanies awareness. It is said that the great silence begins after compline, the last prayer of the day. It extends through the night until the morning's first service, creating a period of many hours when even necessary speech is avoided, when the monks move through darkness and into dawn without breaking the collective quiet, without disturbing the stillness that has settled over the monastery like a blessing, like a presence, like something holy that arrives when all the talking stops, when all the words cease, when the verbal mind surrenders its constant construction of meaning, and simply allows reality to be what it is, unfiltered, unmediated, encountered directly in its prelinguistic fullness. The opening image is spatial. You stand in the monastery as day fades, as the monks gather for compline, as the final prayers are chanted in unison, as the voices blend into single sound that rises toward vaulted ceilings and dissipates into silence, leaving only the settling quiet, the deepening stillness, the great silence descending as night arrives, as the day's limited speech gives way to the night's complete quiet, as the community enters together the hours of sustained wordlessness that are not deprivation but gift, not loss but gain, absence, but a different kind of presence. We explore now the practicalities of silent communities, the ways that necessary communication occurs without speech, the systems that develop when words are restricted but life must continue, when community must function but conversation is forbidden, when human connection must be maintained but verbal exchanges are severely limited. Gesture systems emerge, not the elaborate sign languages of the deaf, not formal vocabulary, but practical communications that evolve organically, that allow monks to convey essential information without speaking, to coordinate work without conversation, to maintain the functioning of the monastery without breaking the silence that is not obstacle but essential element of their practice, that must be preserved even when communication is needed, that cannot be casually sacrificed for the convenience of speaking when gesture would suffice, when observation would reveal, when patient attention would make words unnecessary. The quality of attention changes when you cannot simply ask. When speech is unavailable, you must watch more carefully, must infer from context, must understand through observation rather than through explanation, must develop the capacity to read situations, to interpret gestures, to perceive what is needed without being told, to offer what is appropriate without being asked. This heightened attention becomes its own form of connection, perhaps deeper than conversation, perhaps more attentive than dialogue, because it requires presence, requires focus, requires the cultivation of awareness that extends beyond the verbal, that perceives without the mediation of words, that understands through channels that talking usually obscures. The atmosphere throughout is hushed obviously, but not empty. The silence is full of sounds that speech usually drowns, full of the awareness that talking usually distracts from, full of the presence that conversation often interrupts. You hear what you never noticed when people were talking: the wind moving through the cloister, the rain on the roof, the bell that marks the hours, the footsteps in the corridor, the breath of the person beside you in prayer, the sounds of your own body that are always there, but usually ignored beneath the constant stream of words, the inner noise that masquerades as thought, but is really just the verbal mind rehearsing, planning, remembering, commenting, never resting, never quiet, never allowing the deeper silence that exists beneath the surface chatter to emerge, to be noticed, to be inhabited. Some believe that monastic silence was not merely discipline but theology, was not merely rule but recognition, was not merely practice but understanding of something fundamental about the relationship between speech and consciousness, between words and reality, between talking and listening, between the human compulsion to fill every silence with sound and the divine presence that can only be encountered when the human noise stops, when the verbal mind surrenders its dominance, when consciousness consents to be still, to be quiet, to allow the silence to do its work. Beneath the silence of these monastic communities, we sense the magnitude of what they understood, what they were attempting, what they believed about the nature of spiritual transformation. Words can illuminate, can teach, can transmit knowledge from one mind to another, can create communities of understanding, can build bridges between isolated consciousnesses. But words also obscure, also distract, also keep us trapped in the verbal mind, also prevent us from experiencing reality directly, also create veils between the perceiver and the perceived, also generate the constant narration that stands between awareness and the world, that interprets before experiencing, that judges before perceiving, that translates everything into language before allowing it to be encountered in its prelinguistic immediacy. We deepen now into the psychology of voluntary silence, examining what happens in consciousness when the verbal mind is deliberately stilled, when speech is restricted, when the constant internal monologue that usually dominates awareness is recognized as optional, as something that can be suspended, as habit rather than necessity, as pattern that can be interrupted, that can be replaced by something else, by the deeper awareness that exists before words, that perceives without naming, that encounters reality directly without the mediation of linguistic categories, without the filtering of verbal interpretation, without the distancing that occurs when experience is immediately translated into description, when perception is instantly converted into story, when the world is only known through the words we use to contain it. The theology of silence recognizes that God speaks in the quiet, that the still small voice cannot be heard above the din of human conversation, that revelation requires receptivity, that understanding requires listening, that the divine communicates not through adding more words to the world, but through silence that creates space, that opens consciousness, that allows something other than the ego's constant narrative to be heard, to be perceived, to be received as gift rather than constructed as achievement, as grace rather than effort, as what is given when we finally stop talking long enough to notice what has always been present, what has always been available, what the silence contains and reveals, when we consent to enter it, when we vow to keep it, when we choose it, not once, but perpetually, not occasionally, but as the fundamental condition of our lives, not as intermittent practice, but as sustained discipline, as the ground from which occasional speech emerges rather than the interruption of constant talking. The chapter approaches now its culmination, moving toward the chapel where Compline is sung, where the day ends in prayer, where the great silence begins that will last until dawn, where the community gathers one final time, before dispersing into the profound quiet that is not loneliness, but communion, that is not isolation, but profound connection, that is not the absence of communication, but a different form of it, wordless but meaningful, silent but eloquent, empty of speech, but full of presence. Imagine it, the voices raised in unison for the final psalm, the chant filling the space with sound that is somehow compatible with silence, that prepares for silence, that creates silence even while making sound. Because the music is not conversation, not the ego asserting, not the verbal mind constructing, not the usual human noise, but something else, something that honors the quiet even while breaking it. something that creates space, even while filling it, something that teaches silence through sound, that demonstrates through music what pure presence feels like, what consciousness sounds like when it is not narrating but simply being, not explaining but experiencing, talking but listening, nodding to the divine, to the reality that exists beneath words, to the ground of being that silence reveals when all the talking stops. The prayer ends, the monks rise, they bow and turn and walk in silence back to their cells, back to the solitude that is not loneliness, back to the night that will pass without conversation, without the verbal exchanges that usually structure time, without the constant stream of words that usually makes hours knowable, identifiable, separate from each other. In the great silence, time becomes different, becomes continuous, becomes the eternal present that mystics speak of, becomes the now that is not measured in words, that is not divided by speech, that is not fragmented by conversation, but simply is, simply continues, simply holds all the hours in single awareness that the verbal mind cannot contain, cannot structure, cannot understand, but that the silent mind can inhabit, can experience, can be. We close contemplating what it means to live this way, to choose quiet over conversation, to let hours and days and years pass in sustained silence broken only by the necessary words, by the essential speech that serves function, but does not indulge, that communicates need, but does not elaborate, that preserves the quiet even when breaking it, that honors the silence even when speech is required. To choose this life is to recognize that something valuable exists in the absence of words, that consciousness has capacities that talking suppresses, that awareness has depths that conversation prevents us from exploring, that reality can be encountered directly when the verbal mind stops its constant mediation, when the linguistic interpretation pauses, when we consent to experience the world without immediately translating it into description, without instantly converting perception into narrative, without the compulsion to name everything, to explain everything, to reduce the overwhelming complexity of existence to the manageable simplicity of words that can never truly capture what they claim to contain. The great silence deepens. The monastery rests in quiet that is not empty but full, dead but alive, not absence but presence. The monks sleep or pray or sit in their cells experiencing the night without describing it, encountering the silence without breaking it, inhabiting the wordless awareness that exists before language, that persists beneath speech, that can be accessed when talking stops, when the verbal mind surrenders, when consciousness consents to be still. And in that stillness, something speaks, not in words, not in language, but in the silence itself. In the presence that emerges when absence is sustained, in the awareness that blooms when the verbal mind finally rests, when the constant narration ceases, when the world is allowed to be itself without the overlay of interpretation, when reality is encountered directly, immediately, in its prelinguistic fullness that words can only point toward, can only gesture at, can never fully capture, because language is always reduction, always simplification, always the attempt to contain in categories what refuses containment, to describe in terms what transcends description, to name what exists before naming. In the silence before speech, in the awareness before words, in the presence that can only be known when all the talking stops and the vow of silence reveals not absence, but fullness, not emptiness but plenum, not loss but gain, not deprivation but gift, not the end of communication, but its deepening, not the failure of connection, but its perfection, in the wordless understanding that exists between souls who have learned to be quiet together, who have discovered what emerges when speaking stops, who have entered the great silence and found it contains everything, reveals everything, offers everything that words promise but can never quite deliver, that talking gestures toward but obscures, that the verbal mind seeks but prevents, that can only be encountered in the silence. They vowed to keep forever the quiet. They chose not once, but perpetually, the wordlessness they inhabit, not as punishment, but as practice, not as deprivation, but as discipline, not as absence, but as the deepest presence, the holiest space, the most Profound awareness that exists in the silence, in the quiet, in the great stillness, where God speaks without words, and the soul listens without language, and consciousness rests in the eternal now that exists before speech beneath words. In the silence that is not nothing but everything, not empty but full, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that sound would only disturb, that words would only obscure, that speech would only interrupt, that can only be known in the silence, in the quiet, in the wordless awareness that the monks inhabit, that they practice, that they preserve through their vow, through their discipline, through their choice to speak less so they might hear more, to be quiet so they might be present, to keep silent so they might encounter what the silence contains, what it reveals, what it offers to those willing to stop talking long enough to discover what exists in the space between words, in the awareness before language, in the consciousness that precedes speech and continues after speech and persists beneath speech, waiting patiently for the talking to stop, for the silence to deepen, for the great quiet to begin that will last not just hours, but forever, just through the night, but through all nights, not just in this life, but in whatever comes after, in the eternal silence that waits beyond all words, that contains all meaning, that is both the beginning and the end, the first word and the last, the silence before speech and the silence after, the great quiet that holds everything, that reveals everything, that offers everything to those who learn to keep it, who vow to preserve it, who choose to inhabit it not occasionally but perpetually, not as absence, but as presence, not as nothing, but as everything, not as the end of communication, but as its perfection, its completion, its fulfillment. In the silence they vowed to keep forever. The door they sealed but never locked. There is an entrance to a tomb in the desert, sealed with plaster and mud brick, marked with inscriptions that warn of consequences, but not defended by anything except the belief that crossing this threshold uninvited would bring disaster. The seal is fragile. A determined person could break through in minutes, could violate the closure with tools no more sophisticated than what any peasant possessed, could enter the chamber that was meant to remain undisturbed for eternity. Yet the seal was made with care, was smoothed and finished, was inscribed with curses and prayers, was treated as if it were protection, as if it were barrier, as if it would actually prevent entry, rather than merely mark the boundary between permitted and forbidden, between the world of the living and the resting place of the dead, between the space anyone could enter and the space that only the authorized should approach. This is the unsealed boundary, the threshold that depends not on force, but on respect, not on mechanism, but on belief, not on physical prevention, but on social contract, on the internalized understanding that some doors should not be opened even when nothing prevents their opening, that some spaces should not be entered even when entry is physically possible, that some limits should be honored not because they cannot be violated, but because violation would be wrong, would be transgression, would be the breaking not of lock but of trust, not of barrier, but of covenant. The emotional journey follows this recognition, examining what it meant for communities to rely on unsealed boundaries, to trust that what was sacred would be respected not because it was defended, but because people had been properly socialized to recognize sanctity, to understand prohibition, to internalize the norms that made physical enforcement unnecessary, that allowed custom to substitute for coercion, that enabled belief to function as barrier more effective than any wall, because it existed not in space but in consciousness, not outside but inside, not in the world but in the minds of those who might violate, who might transgress, who might cross the threshold if they did not believe, if they had not been taught, if the social contract had not been so thoroughly internalized that even when alone, even when unobserved, even when violation would be easy and detection unlikely, they would still respect the seal, would still honor the boundary, would still recognize that some doors are closed for reasons that transcend the merely physical. It is said that ancient Egyptian tombs were sealed but not locked, that the builders created barriers that were symbolic more than practical, that could be broken through by anyone willing to risk the consequences, supernatural and social both. The curses inscribed on tomb walls warned that violating the burial would bring death, disease, judgment by the gods who protected the deceased, who would not allow the robbery to go unpunished, who would ensure that those who disturbed the sacred rest would themselves find no rest, would suffer in this life and the next, would discover that what seemed like opportunity was actually trap, that the treasures they stole would bring only misfortune, that the cosmos itself would respond to their transgression with justice that human authorities might fail to deliver, but that divine powers would inevitably impose. Did people believe these curses? The archaeological evidence is mixed. Many tombs remained inviolate for millennia, their seals unbroken, their contents undisturbed, suggesting that respect for the dead or fear of consequences was sufficient deterrent, that the unsealed boundary functioned as intended, that belief protected what force could not have protected better. But many other tombs were plundered, often within decades of burial, sometimes by those who had helped construct them, who knew the layout, who understood the defenses, who apparently weighed the risk of divine punishment against the certainty of material gain, and chose the treasures over the taboo, chose violation over respect, chose transgression over compliance with the norms that made unsealed boundaries possible. The opening image is spatial, you standing before the sealed entrance, close enough to touch the plaster that covers the doorway, close enough to see the hieroglyphs that warn against entry, close enough to realize that nothing substantial prevents you from breaking through, from crossing this threshold, from entering the space that was meant to remain sealed, that depended for its security not on your inability to enter, but on your unwillingness to violate, on your respect for boundaries, on your internalization of the social contract that makes some doors off limits, even when they are not locked, even when they are not guarded, even when violation would be easy and perhaps profitable. We explore now the economy of tomb robbing, the practical reality that existed alongside the theoretical prohibition, the way that economic incentive and sacred respect competed, sometimes with respect winning, sometimes with incentive prevailing, sometimes with the outcome depending on factors we can only guess at. How strong was the belief in divine punishment? How desperate was the economic situation? How effective was the socialization that taught respect for the dead? How powerful was the enforcement, not divine but human, not supernatural but legal, that might catch robbers and impose penalties that were immediate and certain rather than eventual and speculative? The fact that so many tombs were plundered suggests that unsealed boundaries were only partially effective, that trust was insufficient protection when the stakes were high enough, when the treasures were valuable enough, when the need or greed was strong enough to overcome belief, to risk consequences, to transgress despite the warnings, despite the curses, despite the social and supernatural sanctions that were supposed to prevent precisely this violation, this crossing of the threshold that should not be crossed, this breaking of the seal that should not be broken. Yet, the fact that some tombs remained inviolate suggests that the system was not complete failure, that belief did sometimes function as barrier, that respect did sometimes protect what force could not have protected better, that the unsealed boundary did occasionally achieve its purpose, did preserve what it was meant to preserve, did keep sacred what it was meant to keep sacred, not through mechanism, but through the more powerful protection of internalized prohibition, of socialized respect, of the conviction that some things should not be done regardless of whether they can be done, regardless of whether detection is likely, regardless of whether the consequences are certain. The atmosphere throughout is one of boundary consciousness, of recognizing that every threshold marks a moral as well as physical transition, that doors and seals and barriers are not just practical obstacles, but symbolic markers, that they say something about how we understand space and sanctity, privacy and respect, the limits that define us, as much as the freedoms we claim, the prohibitions that make society possible, as much as the permissions that make it livable. Some believe that what changed between societies that relied on unsealed boundaries and modern security consciousness is not just technology but trust, not just capability, but social fabric, not just the availability of locks, but the necessity of locks, the recognition or assumption that respect cannot be counted on, that socialization is insufficient, that what needs protecting must be physically defended, because internalized norms are unreliable, because not everyone shares the same values, because diversity of belief means that what one person considers sacred, another might consider superstition, because the social contract that made unsealed boundaries possible has frayed or been replaced by contracts that assume self-interest, that anticipate violation, that prepare for transgression as normal rather than aberrant, as expected rather than exceptional. Beneath the silence of sealed but unlocked doors, we sense the magnitude of what was lost if this interpretation is correct, if we have truly transitioned from societies of trust to societies of suspicion, from communities where boundaries were respected to communities where boundaries must be enforced, from worlds where the seal was sufficient to worlds where locks are necessary, where guards are required, where surveillance is assumed, where every threshold must be defended because none can be trusted to be honored without defense. Or perhaps the change is not moral decline, but realistic acknowledgement, not loss of virtue but recognition of reality. Not the falling away from better past, but the honest admission that the past was never as virtuous as we imagine, that tomb robbing was always common, that boundaries were always violated, that respect was always partial, that what seems like modern cynicism is actually ancient wisdom. The understanding that trust is beautiful, but insufficient, that ideals are lovely but incomplete, that communities need enforcement as well as internalization, as well as norms, barriers as well as beliefs, because human nature is mixed, is capable of respect and violation both, is socialized but also self-interested, is capable of honoring boundaries and also capable of transgressing them when the incentive is sufficient, when the opportunity is available, when the belief is weak or the need is strong, or the socialization is incomplete. We deepen now into the choice that unsealed boundaries present, the test they offer, the moral weight they place on those who encounter them. To stand before a sealed but unlocked door is to confront not just physical threshold, but existential question. Will you respect the boundary even though you could violate it? Will you honor the seal even though you could break it? Will you recognize the sanctity even though no force compels your recognition? No mechanism enforces your compliance. No guard prevents your transgression? The unsealed boundary asks, are you the kind of person who respects limits even when limits are not enforced? Are you the kind of person who honors prohibitions even when prohibitions are not defended? Are you the kind of person who recognizes that some thresholds should not be crossed, regardless of your ability to cross them, regardless of your desire to cross them, regardless of the absence of physical prevention? This is not question of strength but of character, not test of ability but of integrity, not challenge to overcome, but invitation to honor, to respect, to participate in the social contract that makes unsealed boundaries possible, that allows trust to substitute for force, that assumes we will be better than our worst impulses, that hopes we will honor what we could easily violate, that believes that most people, most of the time, will respect boundaries even when boundaries are not physically enforced, even when violation would be easy, even when transgression would be profitable. The chapter closes with you standing before the sealed door, contemplating the choice it presents. The seal is fragile. You could break through. The inscriptions warn of consequences, but provide no physical obstacle. The boundary exists more in consciousness than in space, more in belief than in matter, more in the social contract than in material reality. Will you cross? Will you violate? Will you transgress? Or will you honor the boundary, respect the seal? Recognize that some doors are closed for reasons that transcend your convenience, your curiosity, your potential gain. Will you be the kind of person who makes unsealed boundaries possible, who allows trust to function, who participates in the social contract that assumes respect rather than enforces compliance, that hopes for honor rather than requires guards, that believes that most people will do the right thing even when the wrong thing would be easier, more profitable, more satisfying to curiosity or need? The door waits in its sealed state, neither locked nor open, neither defended nor entirely vulnerable, existing in that liminal space between trust and force, between belief and mechanism, between the world where respect suffices and the world where locks are necessary, between the society where unsealed boundaries function and the society where every threshold must be defended between the past that may never have existed as we imagine it and the present that may be more cynical or more realistic, more distrustful or more honest, more fallen or simply more aware of what has always been true, that boundaries are always tested, that respect is always partial, that the unsealed door is always invitation and test both, always question and challenge, always the marker of the line between those who honor what they could violate and those who violate what they could honor, but between those who respect the sacred and those who transgress it, between those who keep the social contract and those who break it, between the society that is possible when most people honor unsealed boundaries and the society that becomes necessary when most people do not. When trust fails, when respect proves insufficient, when the seal alone is inadequate and the lock becomes required, when the unsealed boundary gives way to the defended threshold, when trust is replaced by force, when belief is supplanted by mechanism, when the door that was sealed but never locked becomes the door that must be both sealed and locked, that must be defended as well as closed, that must be protected by barrier as well as by belief. Because belief alone has proven insufficient, respect alone has proven inadequate, trust alone has proven unable to protect what needs protecting, to preserve what needs preserving, to keep sacred what needs keeping sacred. Perhaps that is the loss, not that we have fallen from perfect virtue, but that we can no longer rely on imperfect virtue being sufficient, that we have acknowledged that trust must be supplemented, that respect must be reinforced, that boundaries must be defended as well as marked, that the unsealed door is beautiful ideal but inadequate reality, that the seal alone cannot protect, that the curse alone cannot deter, that the boundary alone cannot prevent, that what we wish were true, that respect suffices, that belief protects, that trust allows unsealed boundaries to function, is not quite true, was never entirely true, will perhaps never be true, and so we lock what we once merely sealed. We guard what we once merely marked. We enforce what we once merely hoped would be honored. Not because we are worse, but because we are realistic. Not because we have fallen, but because we have recognized that the fall was always there, that violation was always possible, that transgression was always actual, that the unsealed boundary was always test, that some would pass and others would fail, and that the passing rate was never quite high enough to protect what needed protecting, to preserve what needed preserving, to keep sacred what needed keeping sacred. The door stands in its sealed state, waiting for your choice, waiting for your character, waiting to discover whether you are one who honors boundaries or one who violates them, whether you respect what you could transgress or transgress what you could respect, whether you are part of the social fabric that makes unsealed boundaries possible or part of the force that makes them inadequate, that makes lux necessary, that transforms trust into nostalgia, respect into rarity, the unsealed boundary into relic of a past that perhaps never quite was, a beautiful idea that never quite worked, an ideal that remains ideal because reality consistently fell short, because violation was always too common, because respect was always too partial, because the door they sealed but never locked was always open to those willing to break the seal, to cross the threshold, to violate the boundary, to transgress the sacred, to take what was not theirs to take, enter what was not theirs to enter, to break what was not theirs to break, the seal, the trust, the social contract, the belief that respect alone could protect, that trust alone could preserve, that the unsealed boundary could function, could endure, could keep sacred what it sealed, could protect, what it closed, could preserve, what it marked but did not defend, what it warned but did not prevent, what it sealed but never locked. The ink they made from sacred smoke in the high mountains, where mist clings to stone and silence has weight. There are halls where lamps have burned for centuries. Their flames have never been extinguished. They flicker before golden faces, before painted eyes that seem to hold the memory of all who have knelt before them. And the smoke that rises from these flames, thin, gray, patient, does not simply vanish into the rafters. It is caught, collected, transformed. This is the smoke that becomes holy. It is said that in Buddhist monasteries across the spine of Asia, Monks once practiced an art that blurred the line between craft and devotion. They would suspend ceramic plates above oil lamps that burned perpetually before images of the Buddha, before bodhisattvas painted on silk, before thankas whose colors had not faded in 500 years. Night after night, the smoke would rise, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, soot would settle on the cool surface of the plate, black as the space between stars, fine as thought itself. This soot was sacred, not because it was chemically different from any other carbon, not because it burned hotter or purer, but because of where it had been, because it had risen in offering, because it had been present in the room when prayers were spoken, when foreheads touched stone, when the silence between breaths became a kind of listening. The smoke had passed through sacred space, had floated before the painted gaze of awakened beings, had absorbed, or so it was believed, something of that atmosphere, something unseen, something that mattered. When enough soot had accumulated, a monk would carefully scrape it from the plate with a thin blade. The black powder would be mixed with animal glue and water, ground slowly on an inkstone until it became liquid, until it flowed. And then, only then, it was ready. Ink made from smoke. Ink made from offering. With this ink, they would copy sutras. The belief was simple and profound, that words written with sacred ink carried the blessing of the smoke from which they were made. That the material substance of a religious text was not neutral, arbitrary, but saturated with meaning. That what something is made from affects what it becomes. That carbon collected as offering is not the same as carbon scraped from a chimney, even if a chemist could find no difference between them. This was not superstition. Or perhaps it was something deeper than superstition, a recognition that intention changes matter, that context is not decoration, but essence, that the physical and the metaphysical do not occupy separate worlds, but interpenetrate like smoke and air. Imagine the scene: a writing hall in winter, high in the mountains where the air is thin and cold. A monk sits before a low table. His back is straight. His breathing is measured. Before him lies a sheet of paper made from mulberry bark, prepared according to methods passed down through generations. Beside him, a stone well holds ink that was smoked 3 days ago. He dips his brush made from rabbit hair, bound with silk thread, and begins to write. Each character forms slowly. The brush lifts and presses, curves and pauses. The text he copies is ancient, words spoken by the Buddha 25 centuries before, translated from Sanskrit into Chinese, from Chinese into Tibetan, carried across deserts and mountains, memorized, chanted, argued over, illuminated, lost, rediscovered, and now, emerging again on this paper, written in ink that rose as smoke before a golden face. The monk does not hurry. Copying scriptures is merit-making. Each stroke is an act of devotion, and the ink itself, drawn from the atmosphere of prayer, from the breath of lamps that have burned in dedication, makes the act more potent. The words are not simply recorded. They are consecrated, made holy through the holiness of their materials. This understanding extended far beyond ink. In manuscript traditions across the religious world, the sanctity of materials was taken with absolute seriousness. Parchment for Torah scrolls could only be made from the hides of kosher animals, prepared according to ritual law. The quills that wrote them had to be cut in specific ways. Even the thread that bound the pages had to meet certain standards, as if holiness required integrity at every level, as if God cared not just about the words, but about the skin that held them. In medieval Europe, monks ground pigments from stones believed to carry protective properties. Lapis lazuli, mined from mountains in Afghanistan, was crushed to create the brilliant blue used for the Virgin Mary's robes in illuminated manuscripts. The stone had traveled thousands of miles. Its color was rarer than gold. To paint with it was to honor the sacred with the most precious substance the earth could offer. Gold leaf was applied to manuscripts not only for beauty but for preservation. Gold does not tarnish. It does not fade. A text written in gold and lapis would outlast empires, would survive floods and fires, would carry the words of Scripture into futures unimaginable to the scribe who made them. The materials were chosen not just for their splendor, but for their endurance, their ability to hold meaning across the abyss of time. Everywhere, in every tradition, the same pattern. Sacred things required sacred materials. Or perhaps it was the reverse, materials became sacred through their use in holy work. The distinction blurs, dissolves, in the careful preparation of ink from smoke, in the grinding of stone into pigment, in the tanning of hide. According to ancient prescription, there was a refusal to separate the practical from the spiritual, a recognition that matter matters, that the world is not divided into physical and metaphysical realms, but is one seamless whole, and everything within it can be sanctified. The monk continues writing. His brush moves like breath, steady and certain. Outside, snow begins to fall, silent and slow. The lamp before the Buddha burns. Its flame does not waver, and the smoke rises as it has risen for centuries, as it will continue to rise long after this particular text is finished, long after the monk has set down his brush and bowed to the image and walked back into the cold mountain air. The soot collects on the plate above the flame. Tomorrow, or the next day, someone will scrape it carefully into a bowl. Someone will mix it with glue. Someone will grind it on stone till it flows like water, like ink, like the river of transmission that carries sacred words from one generation to the next. And perhaps this is the deeper truth the practice reveals, that nothing is separate, that the smoke that rises in prayer and the ink that forms words are not different substances, but different moments in a continuous transformation, that the text copied with sacred ink is connected to the flame that burned, to the devotion that maintained it, to the silence of the hall, to the mountain that holds the monastery, to the entire interwoven system of practice and belief that makes meaning possible. The words appear on paper, black characters on white ground, ink made from smoke, smoke offered to the sacred, sacred presence dwelling in material form returning to service of the sacred. The cycle has no beginning. The distinction between creator and created dissolves like smoke into air. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. Some truths are written not in fire, but in the soot that fire leaves behind. And perhaps the deepest teaching is this, that everything can be sanctified, that the physical world is not separate from the spiritual, but is its manifestation, that even carbon common, black, the residue of burning, can become holy when gathered with intention, blessed with care, and offered back to the mystery from which it came. The lamp burns on, the smoke rises, the ink waits in its stone well, dark and still and ready. Perhaps it was never about the ink at all. Perhaps it was always about the seeing, the recognition that nothing is merely itself, that everything carries more than it appears to hold, that the world is drenched in meaning for those who learn to look. The snow falls outside. The brush moves across paper, and somewhere in the darkness, smoke becomes sacred, word becomes flesh, and the eternal writes itself in characters of soot and devotion. The circle they drew, but could not close. There is a moment, just before dawn, when the world holds its breath between darkness and light, neither night nor day, neither beginning nor end. It is in this liminal hour that certain truths become visible. Truths about circles that will not close, about patterns that promise return but deliver transformation instead. Imagine a monk in the high desert, kneeling before an expanse of raked sand. In his hand, a stick. With careful intention, he begins to trace a circle. Slowly, the line curves through the pale dust, sweeping in a perfect arc. Around and around his hand moves, guided by years of practice, by the desire for precision. And then, inevitably, the moment arrives when the ending must meet the beginning. But it does not. The gap is small, almost invisible, yet it persists. No matter how carefully he adjusts, how minutely he corrects, the line never quite connects. The circle remains open, incomplete. The perfection, he sought, the seamless closure, the perfect return to origin remains just beyond reach. This is not failure. This is truth. It is said that across mathematical and mystical traditions, the circle represents the ultimate symbol, perfection, completion, eternity, the return to beginning, the Ouroboros swallowing its tail, the wheel of Dharma turning endlessly, the liturgical year cycling through its festivals, the seasons revolving in their appointed rhythm. Everywhere, the promise of return. Everywhere, the hope of completion. Yet beneath this promise lies a more subtle reality. The circles we draw are aspirational. They describe not what is, but what we wish were. Because when we look closely, truly closely at any circle in nature, in time, in consciousness, we find that none of them actually close. Each revolution is slightly different. Each return arrives at a place that only resembles the origin. The line curves back toward where it began, but by the time it arrives, both the line and the beginning have changed. We are not moving in circles. We are moving in spirals. Consider the mandala, that intricate circular diagram created grain by grain of colored sand by Tibetan monks. For days, sometimes weeks, they work creating elaborate geometric patterns that radiate from a central point, building a universe in miniature, a complete cosmology rendered in pigment and precision. The circle is perfect. The symmetry is absolute. And then, in a ritual that seems almost cruel, they destroy it. They sweep it away. The perfection is unmade. The circle is broken, and the sand is carried to a river, where it disperses, where the pattern dissolves into flowing water, into the world's endless becoming. Why? Why create what will not last? Why draw the circle knowing it cannot hold? Perhaps because the point was never the completion. Perhaps the point was always the drawing, the attention, the devotion to form while acknowledging its impermanence. Perhaps the destroyed mandala is more honest than the preserved one. Perhaps the circle that breaks teaches more than the circle that endures. Whispers tell us that in the earliest calendars, humans tried to make the year circular to create a system where time would return perfectly to its starting point, where the count of days would align with the count of seasons, where the circles of moon and sun would synchronize into one grand cosmic wheel. But they could not. The numbers would not cooperate. The moon's cycle and the sun's cycle refused to divide evenly. Leap days had to be invented. Corrections had to be made. The calendar became not a circle, but a constant adjustment, a perpetual approximation, an acceptance that perfect return was impossible. The seasons come again. Yes, spring returns after winter's silence, but it is never the same spring. The blossoms open on different days. The temperature shifts. The rain falls with different rhythm, and we ourselves, returning to the spring festival, to the equinox celebration, to the ritual we performed last year, we are not the same people who performed it before. We have aged. We have changed. We carry different sorrows, different joys, different knowledge. The circle appears to close, but we have moved along a spiral. We are at the same angle, but at a different height. In forgotten corners of sacred texts, there are descriptions of cosmic cycles, so vast, they beggar comprehension. The yugas of Hindu cosmology, measuring time in millions of years. The great year of Plato, when all celestial bodies return to their original positions. The Buddhist kalpa, the eon it would take for a bird to wear away a mountain by brushing it once every 100 years with a silk cloth. These cycles promise return. But on such scales, what does return mean? If the universe completes a circuit in billions of years, returning all stars to their starting positions, would it be the same universe? Would consciousness, having passed through such vast reaches of time, recognize its own beginning? Or would the appearance of return mask an essential transformation, movement not backward to origin, but forward to something that only resembles origin, that echoes it, but is not identical to it? The atmosphere in the desert has changed. The monk has finished his circle, or finished trying. He sits back on his heels. The line in the sand curves almost all the way around, coming so close to closure that from a distance it might appear complete. But there is a gap, thin as a whisper, persistent as truth. He does not try again. He does not erase and redraw. He simply sits, looking at what he has made. This circle that is not quite a circle. This completion that remains incomplete. This ending that does not quite reach its beginning. And perhaps in this moment, there is acceptance. Perhaps there is even joy. Because the impossibility of closure is not failure. It is accuracy. The open circle tells the truth that the closed circle conceals. That we cannot step into the same river twice. That time does not return, but spirals forward. That consciousness evolves rather than revolves. That the pattern of existence is not repetition, but variation on a theme. Life itself is the circle that cannot close. Birth, growth, decay, death, and then Some traditions promise rebirth, but not the same life, not the same consciousness. The wheel turns, but it also moves forward. The spiral curves back toward familiar territory, but always at a new level, always with transformation embedded in the apparent return. The liturgical year cycles through its festivals. Christmas comes again. Easter returns. The faithful gather for prayers they have spoken 100 times before. But each time, the words land differently. Each time, the gathering includes different faces, different absences. Each time, the heart that receives the ritual has been changed by the year that preceded it. The circle appears to close, but it is really a spiral. We arrive at the same calendar date, but at a different point in our lives, in history and understanding. Is this tragedy or liberation? The tragedy would be if we expected perfect return and found only change. If we drew the circle hoping for completion and discovered only approximation. If we believed the promise of eternal return and found instead perpetual becoming. But the liberation is in accepting that the circle was never meant to close. That the gap is not error but essence. That the spiral is not a failure to be circular, but a more honest form. That we are not trapped in endless repetition, but invited into endless evolution. Where memory fades, the distinction between circle and spiral blurs. From a distance, they look the same. Both curve. Both return to familiar angles. But one closes and one opens. And the difference between them is the difference between stasis and growth, between repetition and transformation, between death and life. The monk rises. The wind, which has been still, begins to move. It touches the rake sand, the almost circle, the gap that persists. Grain by grain, the line begins to blur. By tomorrow, it will be gone. The sand will be smooth again, ready for another attempt. Another circle that will not close. Another perfect imperfection. Perhaps this is the final teaching, that completion is not the goal. That the circle that cannot close is more beautiful than the circle that can. That the line curving back toward its origin, but never quite arriving, is the truest description of what we are, what time is, what consciousness does. We draw the circle knowing it will remain open. We trace the pattern knowing it will dissolve. We return to the beginning knowing we have change. Knowing the beginning has change. Knowing that return is really advance disguised as repetition, spiral disguised as circle, becoming disguised as being. The wind continues, the sand shifts, and somewhere in the distance, the sun breaks the horizon, neither ending the night nor beginning the day, but doing both and neither, dwelling in the space between, in the gap that cannot close, in the circle that must remain open if anything is to continue, if anything is to grow, if anything is to become what it has not yet imagined it might be. Perhaps it was never meant to close. Perhaps the opening is the point. Perhaps the gap is not where we failed to complete the circle, but where the circle completes itself by remaining incomplete, by staying open, by inviting the continuation that closure would end. The line curves, it returns, it approaches its origin, and then it rises, or deepens, or simply persists in its slight displacement, in its honest refusal to pretend that endings and beginnings are the same, that we can go back, that the circle ever truly closes. Some truths are too true to be perfect, some circles too honest to be complete, and in that incompletion, perhaps, lies everything.